I am about to share something with you that could genuinely change how you see money for the rest of your life. You are going to learn how to understand the system banks have built around us, and how to use that same system to your advantage instead of letting it work against you. Here is something most people never stop to consider. People generally fall into three groups. The first group uses credit to pay for things they cannot afford outright. This group leans on credit constantly, and the bank profits steadily from their borrowing. The second group avoids credit almost entirely. They have the means to buy cars, equipment, and major purchases with their own cash. They believe avoiding credit protects them from paying extra to the bank, and in many ways, they are right. They already understand more about money than the first group does. But there is a third group, a group that understands something deeper about how banking and the broader economy actually function. This group has learned to use leverage in a way that builds real wealth, and they profit from both of the other two groups. They are not breaking any laws. They have simply learned to read the rules clearly enough to use the system instead of being used by it. In this audiobook, we are going to talk about compound interest, real estate, how to use loans wisely, and how to structure debt so it works for you with minimal ongoing effort on your part. Here is the lie you were told about debt. Debt is not your enemy. That is the first truth most people are too afraid to say out loud. You were trained to fear it, conditioned to avoid it, taught that borrowing money is a sign of weakness. But here is the truth. The wealthy do not avoid debt. They use it deliberately. And the real difference between the middle class and the financially powerful is not income. It is leverage. Welcome to Make the Bank Work for You. This is not about reckless borrowing. This is not about financing a lifestyle you cannot afford. This is about understanding a system that was built for owners and using loans as the bridge to ownership. Ask yourself something honest. If debt is truly so dangerous, why do major corporations carry billions of dollars of it? Why do billionaires finance assets instead of paying cash outright? Why are banks eager to lend to people who already have money? Because debt itself is not the danger. Uneducated debt is. There are two types of borrowers in this world, the desperate and the strategic. The desperate borrow to consume. The strategic borrow to control. And control is exactly where real wealth lives. Before we begin, if you are watching on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We release powerful audiobooks every single week, the kind that shift how you think about money permanently. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let us get into it. When you borrow for consumption, you shrink your financial position. When you borrow for acquisition, you expand it. That is the dividing line that separates the financially stuck from the financially free. And we are about to walk through exactly how to stand on the right side of it. Chapter 1. The lie you were told about debt. Most people use loans to buy liabilities, cars, vacations, clothing, lifestyle upgrades, and every single payment quietly makes them a little poorer. But the wealthy borrow differently. They borrow to acquire cash-flowing property, revenue-generating businesses, and equity-producing systems. They borrow money specifically to make more money, and the bank, without realizing it, becomes their silent business partner. Think about that for a moment. The same institution that profits from most people's financial confusion becomes a genuine tool in the hands of someone who actually understands how it works. Debt is not slavery. Irresponsible debt is. There is a real psychological shift you have to make before you can ever use loans strategically. You have to stop thinking like a consumer. Consumers ask, "What can I afford monthly?" Investors ask, "What does this asset return annually?" That single question changes absolutely everything about how you approach money. A consumer looks at a $50,000 car and sees a $700 monthly payment. An investor looks at that same $700 and asks a completely different question. What asset could I control with this payment that actually pays me back over time? That shift in thinking is where real financial power begins. You were told to avoid debt, but no one ever explained how the wealthy actually use it. They understand leverage. Leverage is control without full ownership. It is the ability to command a $500,000 asset using only $100,000 of your own money. It is using other people's capital to expand your financial footprint faster than you ever could alone. It is, in the simplest terms, a way of compressing time. Without leverage, wealth grows in a straight line. With leverage, wealth grows exponentially. Let us break that down clearly. If you save $20,000 a year, it will take you 25 years to accumulate $500,000. That is linear growth. But if you use that same $20,000 as a down payment on an appreciating asset, you control something far larger than your own savings could ever produce alone. You compress decades into years, and time is the single most valuable currency that exists. The middle class trades time for money. The wealthy use money to control time. That is precisely what intelligent loans allow you to do, if and only if you understand the rules that govern them. But before we move any further, hear this clearly. Loans magnify discipline. They do not fix recklessness. If you are careless, debt will eventually destroy you. If you are calculated and intentional, debt will elevate you. It is the exact same tool, producing two completely different outcomes depending entirely on the person holding it. Debt is like fire. In the wrong hands, it burns the house down. In the right hands, it powers the entire engine of a growing financial life. Most people get burned simply because no one ever taught them how to control the flame. By the end of this audiobook, you will see loans differently. You will stop fearing interest the way you once did. You will stop seeing banks as predators and start seeing them as fuel stations, because fuel itself is neutral. It is the vehicle and the driver that determine where it ultimately leads. Here is the uncomfortable truth. If you refuse to ever understand leverage, you will always build wealth more slowly than those who do. You can avoid debt your entire life, pay cash for everything, and feel perfectly safe and you will likely remain financially average for the rest of your life. Or you can learn to use debt strategically, not emotionally, not impulsively, and not out of greed, but with real intelligence. This is not about being flashy. This is about being financially effective. It is about building machines that produce consistent cash flow. It is about controlling assets that grow faster than the cost of borrowing against them. It is about making the bank finance your expansion instead of financing your consumption. So let us ask the real question hiding underneath all of this. What if the reason you fear loans is simply because no one ever showed you how to use them correctly? What if the real problem has never been debt itself, but a lack of financial education? And what if mastering this one area of money changes nearly everything else in your financial life? In the next chapter, we are going to break down the very first unbreakable rule, the rule that ultimately determines whether debt makes you wealthy or destroys you. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. And the line between those two things is thinner than most people ever realize. Chapter 2. The first rule. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. There is a line. It is invisible. It is subtle. And most people cross it without ever realizing they did. On one side of that line sits strategic debt. On the other side sits ego debt. One builds genuine wealth over time. The other builds stress, pressure, and quiet financial decline. And the real difference between them has nothing to do with the size of the loan. It has everything to do with the intention behind it. You need to understand this before anything else in this entire audiobook makes sense. Debt used for ego is financial poison. Debt used for acquisition is financial leverage. Let us define acquisition properly, because the word gets misused constantly. Acquisition means gaining control of something that actually produces value. Not something that simply impresses people, not something that depreciates the moment you buy it, not something that temporarily boosts your image, but something that creates measurable, recurring value over time. The wealthy do not borrow money to look powerful. They borrow money to actually become powerful. And those two paths lead to two completely different financial destinations. Here is the trap that catches most people. Consumer debt almost always feels justified in the moment. You tell yourself, I need this car for work. I deserve this vacation. I have earned this upgrade. I will pay it off quickly. And maybe you genuinely will. But that is not really the point. The real question is simple. Does this debt generate income? If the answer is no, you are feeding someone else's financial machine instead of building your own. When you borrow for ego, cash moves in one direction only, out of your pocket, every single month, for years. When you borrow for acquisition, cash moves in two directions, into the asset and then back to you. That is the test you should run every single time you consider taking on debt. Picture two people side by side. Person A takes out a $50,000 loan to buy a luxury SUV. Person B takes out the exact same $50,000 loan as a down payment on a small rental property. Both of them owe the bank money. Both of them have a monthly payment due. But here is where their paths diverge sharply. Person A makes that payment directly out of their salary, month after month, with nothing coming back. Person B's tenant makes that payment through rent, money that flows through the asset and back to its owner. Same amount of debt, completely different structure. One person is slowly drained, the other person is steadily building. One becomes more dependent on their job to survive. The other becomes progressively less dependent on any single paycheck over time. That is the real difference between borrowing emotionally and borrowing strategically. Now let us talk honestly about ego, because ego debt is sneaky by design. It does not scream bad decision the way you might expect. It whispers instead. It tells you that you are falling behind, that everyone else seems to be upgrading their life, that you should be further along by now, that you deserve more right now, and in response, you finance a lifestyle instead of building real leverage. You mistake visibility for actual progress. But genuine wealth is rarely visible in its early stages. It is built quietly, patiently, and methodically, often while looking completely ordinary to everyone watching from the outside. The wealthy generally do not upgrade their personal lifestyle every time their income rises. They upgrade their asset base instead. There is a real discipline required here, because borrowing for acquisition demands patience. It often means delaying gratification. It often means saying no to lifestyle upgrades that everyone around you seems to be enjoying. It often means looking financially average on the surface while building something genuinely powerful underneath. That is not weakness. That is financial maturity in action. Let us break acquisition down into the categories that actually qualify as strategic. First, cash-flowing real estate. Second, businesses with proven, consistent revenue. Third, revenue-generating equipment. Fourth, scalable digital assets. Fifth, appreciating investments that produce a positive spread between cost and return. Notice carefully what is missing from that list. Cars, clothes, entertainment, furniture, vacations. None of those produce ongoing income. None of those create real leverage. None of those improve your actual net financial position. They only improve how things appear on the surface. And appearance does not pay interest on a loan. Here is the brutal truth underneath all of this. If the asset you acquire does not outpace the actual cost of the capital you borrowed, you are not leveraging anything. You are simply financing consumption with extra steps. And financing consumption is exactly how the middle class remains the middle class generation after generation. Now, let us talk briefly about spread, because we will return to this concept in much greater depth later in the audiobook. Spread is the gap between what your debt costs you and what your asset actually earns you. Borrow at 6% and your asset returns 12%, and you have a 6% positive spread working in your favor. That is wealth-building math. Borrow at 7% on an asset that returns nothing, and you have a guaranteed 7% loss every single year. That is lifestyle math, and lifestyle math compounds in the wrong direction over time. The wealthy analyze carefully before they ever borrow a single dollar. They do not simply ask, "Can I afford this monthly payment?" They ask, "What is the realistic projected return? What is the genuine downside risk? What happens if income drops unexpectedly? What happens if rates shift against me?" They stress test the numbers honestly before committing. They do not hope. Hope is not a financial strategy. Emotion is not a financial strategy. Ego is absolutely not a financial strategy. Precision is the only thing that actually works consistently. You must learn to detach your personal identity from your purchases. The moment your sense of self becomes tied to what you own, you become financially vulnerable. The moment your ego starts demanding upgrades, you become easy to manipulate. Banks genuinely love manipulable borrowers, but they respect disciplined ones far more, and disciplined borrowers are the ones who eventually get the best terms. Here is something rarely said out loud. The bank does not actually care what you buy with the money. They care only that you pay it back reliably. Whether you finance a rental property or a jet ski, the bank still collects their interest either way. But only one of those choices genuinely improves your financial position over time. And here is the mental shift that changes everything moving forward. Start seeing loans as tools for control, not tools for comfort. Control of appreciating assets, control of cash flow, control of the advantages that come with inflation, control, ultimately, of your own time. Because time really is the true currency underneath all of this. When you borrow to acquire real assets, you compress decades of saving into just a few years. When you borrow to consume instead, you stretch decades of payments out ahead of you. One path accelerates your freedom. The other quietly delays it. Remember this clearly. Debt itself is neutral. Your intention is what gives it direction. If your intention is rooted in ego, debt will eventually expose that. If your intention is rooted in genuine acquisition, debt will empower you steadily over time. And that is the first rule you must internalize completely. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. But here is where things get even more important. Even smart, acquisition-based debt can destroy you if you borrow too aggressively. And that brings us directly to the second rule, waiting in the next chapter. Leverage is power. Over-leverage is collapse. And the difference between the two comes down entirely to discipline. Chapter 3. Leverage is power. Over-leverage is collapse. There is a reason empires fall. It is rarely a lack of ambition. It is rarely a lack of opportunity. It is not even, in most cases, a lack of intelligence. It is excess risk, excess expansion, excess confidence, and in finance specifically, excess leverage is the fastest path from powerful to bankrupt that exists. Understand this clearly. Leverage magnifies everything: returns, growth, momentum, and mistakes, all at the same time. The same force that can accelerate your wealth can just as easily accelerate your collapse. So before you ever borrow strategically, you must understand risk at a deep level. Smart debt is not about boldness alone. It is about controlled boldness. Most people misunderstand leverage because they only ever look at the upside. They see appreciation. They see rental income arriving on schedule. They see equity growing steadily. They see business expansion happening right in front of them. But they rarely stop to ask what happens if the income stops. What happens if the asset's value drops? What happens if the market shifts unexpectedly? What happens if interest rates rise sharply? This is exactly where the wealthy separate themselves from the reckless. They plan for the downside first, not the upside. Hope is for amateurs. Risk management is for professionals who intend to stay in the game for decades. Let us talk honestly about over-leverage. It happens when your total debt obligations exceed your financial flexibility. It is when one small disruption suddenly becomes a full-blown catastrophe. It is when a single vacancy turns into a genuine crisis. It is when a routine rate increase becomes financially suffocating. It is, simply put, when you have no margin left at all. Margin is survival. Margin is the breathing space between your income and your obligations. And without that breathing room, panic sets in quickly, and panic destroys clear financial logic every single time. Imagine this scenario. You buy 3 rental properties. Each one barely breaks even every month. You hold no meaningful cash reserves. Everything functions perfectly fine as long as everything continues working perfectly fine. But then one tenant suddenly stops paying. Now you are personally covering that mortgage out of your own income. Then an unexpected repair hits one of the properties. Then interest rates adjust upward at refinancing. Suddenly, the investment that was supposed to build your wealth is draining it instead. This is not fundamentally a leverage problem. This is a margin problem. You borrowed without any cushion. You expanded without any defense in place. And leverage simply exposed a fragility that was already there, waiting to be revealed. Here is the rule to live by. Never borrow up to the absolute maximum amount you qualify for. Banks approve loans based on risk models that are designed to protect themselves, not necessarily you. They genuinely do not care if your personal lifestyle becomes financially tight as a result. They only care that you remain statistically capable of making the payment. You must hold yourself to a more conservative standard than the bank does. If they approve you for $500,000, ask yourself honestly whether $350,000 would actually be safer. If they approve financing for 5 properties, ask whether 3 would genuinely be wiser. Over-leverage is fueled by greed. Strategic leverage is fueled by patience. Now let us talk about your emergency buffer. Every single leveraged asset you hold needs a cash reserve behind it. A minimum of 6 months of payments set aside, and ideally more. Leverage performs best when you are calm, not desperate. Desperation forces bad decisions. It pushes you to sell too early, to refinance on poor terms, to panic when a calmer response would have served you far better. The wealthy do not panic, because they structure their finances for stability from the very beginning. They assume something will eventually go wrong. They expect fluctuation as a normal part of the process. They respect volatility instead of being surprised by it. You must learn to do exactly the same. Let us discuss cash flow specifically. Never rely solely on appreciation in value. Appreciation is speculative by nature. Cash flow is what actually keeps you stable through difficult periods. If an asset pays you something every single month, it strengthens your position. If it only increases in theoretical value on paper, it tempts you without actually protecting you. Paper wealth is genuinely dangerous when it is not supported by real income. If you borrow to acquire an appreciating asset that produces no cash flow at all, you are essentially betting on timing. And timing is notoriously unpredictable. But when an asset generates enough income to cover its own debt payment, that is real stability. That is self-liquidating debt. The asset feeds itself, and that is precisely the goal you should be working toward. Now let us talk about interest rate structure specifically. Fixed rate debt is predictable. Variable rate debt introduces ongoing exposure. When you borrow with a variable rate, you are adding a real layer of uncertainty to your financial picture. Sometimes that added risk is genuinely worth taking. Often, it is not. The wealthy tend to favor fixed-rate debt heavily during inflationary periods, because inflation quietly erodes the real value of their repayment over time. If your payment stays fixed for 30 years, while your income naturally rises with inflation, your debt effectively becomes lighter every single year. You end up repaying with dollars that are worth less than the ones you originally borrowed. This is a genuinely powerful, silent advantage. But if your rate floats upward instead, your margin shrinks instead of growing. Structure matters just as much as the loan amount itself. Here is another critical principle. Never stack short-term debt on top of long-term assets. If you finance a long-term, slowly appreciating asset using short-term debt obligations, you create unnecessary timing risk. If your debt comes due before your asset has had time to stabilize, you may be forced into a poor refinancing situation at exactly the wrong moment. Match the duration of your debt to the duration of your asset. This is how genuine professionals structure their financing. Now let us discuss the psychological side of leverage. The moment your debt begins controlling your emotions, you have lost real control of the situation. If you find yourself checking interest rates daily out of anxiety, you have probably borrowed too aggressively. If you are losing sleep over your monthly payments, your structure is too exposed. Debt should feel calculated and manageable, not crushing. Because when you remain calm, you continue making intelligent decisions. When you become stressed, you start reacting impulsively instead. And reacting impulsively with money is genuinely dangerous. Here is a simple equation worth remembering. Your cash flow should exceed your debt obligation. Your reserves should exceed your likely unexpected expenses. Your income sources should be diverse, rather than dependent on one single source. Your terms should be fixed and predictable, rather than exposed to unpredictable shifts. When those things are true, leverage becomes a genuine accelerator. When they are not true, leverage becomes a weapon working against you instead of for you. The wealthy are not fearless people. They are simply prepared. They do not eliminate risk entirely. That is impossible. They manage it carefully and consistently. And here is the mindset shift worth holding on to. Leverage is not fundamentally about speed. It is about scale. And scale built without a solid foundation underneath it eventually collapses. You are not trying to impress anyone watching from the outside. You are trying to build something genuinely durable. Durable wealth outlasts market cycles. Durable wealth survives recessions intact. Durable wealth actually thrives under sustained pressure, because pressure is exactly what reveals whether your structure was sound to begin with. So ask yourself honestly, are you building fast or are you building strong? Because intelligent leverage is controlled expansion. Over-leverage is ego-driven expansion. And ego, in the end, is the single most expensive liability anyone can carry. In the next chapter, we are going to go deeper into the actual mathematics of spread, because once you genuinely understand how to calculate the gap between your cost of capital and your assets' yield, you stop guessing entirely. You start engineering instead. And engineering wealth is far more reliable and far more powerful than chasing it. Chapter 4. The Mathematics of Spread, where wealth is engineered. If you do not understand spread, you are gambling with your money. If you do understand spread, you are engineering your wealth on purpose. And real, lasting wealth is never built by gamblers. It is built by engineers who respect the numbers. Let us simplify this completely. Spread is the difference between the cost of your debt and the return your asset actually produces. That is the entire concept. Nothing mysterious about it, nothing emotional, just straightforward math. But this single piece of math ultimately decides whether you become financially powerful or financially trapped. Here is the formula in its simplest form. Asset yield minus cost of capital equals spread. If the result is positive and reasonably stable, you are genuinely building wealth. If the result is negative, you are quietly financing your own financial decline, month after month. Let us walk through this clearly with real numbers. Imagine you borrow $200,000 at 6% interest. That means your borrowed capital costs you $12,000 per year in interest. Now imagine the asset you purchased with that money produces $24,000 per year in net income. 24,000 minus 12,000 equals a positive spread of $12,000. That $12,000 is pure leverage profit. You made money using capital that was not even originally yours. That is real financial power in action. Now let us flip that same scenario. If the asset only produces $10,000 per year instead, you now have a negative spread of $2,000. You are subsidizing that asset out of your own pocket. You are feeding it instead of it feeding you. This is exactly why understanding the actual numbers matters more than anything else in this entire process. Hope does not matter here. Optimism does not matter here. Good intentions do not matter here. Math matters. The wealthy do not fall in love with properties, businesses, or shiny opportunities. They fall in love with the numbers behind them. They genuinely do not care if something looks beautiful on the surface. They care whether it performs reliably. They do not care if it impresses their friends at a dinner party. They care whether it produces consistent cash flow month after month. Let us go a layer deeper here. There are two distinct kinds of yield worth understanding: cash yield and total return. Cash yield is the actual money that hits your bank account. Total return includes appreciation in value on top of that. Cash yield protects you during difficult periods. Appreciation rewards you over the long run, but only if you survive long enough to realize it. If you borrow based purely on hoped-for appreciation, you are essentially speculating. If you borrow based on solid, current cash flow, you are stabilizing your position, and stability is exactly what allows you to survive economic downturns when they inevitably arrive. Now here is where this becomes genuinely strategic. Let us say inflation is running at roughly 5%. Your loan is fixed at 4%. Your asset appreciates at around 6% annually. Your rental income rises along with inflation over time. Meanwhile, your loan payment stays exactly the same every single month. You are winning on multiple fronts simultaneously. Your asset is growing faster than the cost of your debt. Inflation is quietly reducing the real burden of your repayment. Your rental income keeps climbing. Your equity keeps compounding in the background. This is the largely invisible advantage of leverage during inflationary periods, but only if your spread remains genuinely positive throughout. Now let us talk about risk-adjusted spread, because not every spread carries the same level of risk. A 4% spread in a volatile, unpredictable business may not actually be worth taking on, compared to a steady 2% spread in stable real estate with reliable long-term tenants. Spread always has to be evaluated alongside the volatility that comes attached to it. Here is the guiding principle. The safer the underlying asset, the smaller the spread you can reasonably accept. The riskier the asset, the larger the spread you should require before committing any capital at all. This is exactly where real discipline comes into play. If you are borrowing at 8%, your asset had better consistently return more than 8%, not just in a good month, but on average, across every realistic scenario you can imagine. Here is exactly how you stress test a deal properly. What happens if revenue drops 20% unexpectedly? What happens if expenses rise 10%? What happens if a vacancy lasts 3 full months? What happens if interest rates increase significantly at the point of refinancing? Does the spread still hold up under those pressures? If yes, you can move forward with reasonable confidence. If no, you wait. And waiting, in this context, is not weakness. Waiting is strategic patience working in your favor. Now let us talk about the single most common mistake people make when running these numbers. They calculate gross income instead of net income, gross rent instead of actual cash flow after expenses, gross sales instead of real profit. You absolutely must subtract operating expenses, maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance, a realistic vacancy allowance, management fees, and a buffer for unexpected repairs before you ever calculate your true yield. This is not pessimism. This is simply realism. The wealthy assume friction will happen along the way. Amateurs assume everything will go perfectly according to plan. Here is something genuinely powerful, worth understanding. Spread compounds over time. If you create a $10,000 annual positive spread and you use that money to acquire a second asset, that new spread grows alongside the first one, then multiplies, then accelerates the entire process. This is exactly how leverage builds real momentum over time. One asset creates cash flow. That cash flow funds your next acquisition. That next acquisition increases your total spread. Increased spread increases your speed of growth. Increased speed increases the opportunities available to you. This is precisely how you make the bank finance your expansion, instead of financing your lifestyle. But here is an uncomfortable truth worth sitting with. Many people chase the largest possible spread and completely ignore sustainability. A risky, projected 15% return is not actually superior to a stable 7% return if volatility ends up destroying your consistency along the way. Consistency is what genuinely builds wealth over time. Dramatic spikes mostly just build interesting stories to tell at parties. Stories do not pay your bills. Consistency does. Here is another useful concept worth adopting: the debt snowball, but applied specifically to assets. Most people take extra cash and immediately upgrade their lifestyle with it. Instead, use your positive spread to eliminate your weaker, less efficient debt first. Strengthen your overall balance sheet. Increase your available margin. Then, expand again from that stronger position. This is controlled expansion, not chaotic, reactive growth. Remember this clearly. Spread is never just about the return itself. It is fundamentally about control. If your spread disappears the moment real pressure hits, you lose control of the situation entirely. If your spread survives genuine downturns intact, you remain calm and in control throughout. And calm investors are the ones who consistently win over the long term. Now let us talk briefly about leverage stacking. Once you genuinely understand spread, you can begin layering your investments intelligently. For example, imagine property A generates $8,000 in positive annual spread. You use that spread to help cover the payments on property B. Property B then begins producing $12,000 in its own spread. Now your combined system is producing $20,000 annually, and you never had to inject a single additional dollar of personal salary to make that happen. You simply reinvested the spread itself. This is exactly how the wealthy compound their wealth without working additional hours. Here is the psychological shift worth making right now. Stop asking yourself, how much debt do I currently have? Start asking instead, what is my net positive spread? Debt by itself, in isolation, means almost nothing. Your net spread is what actually defines your real financial position. Someone carrying $2 million in debt alongside $300,000 in annual positive spread, is in a genuinely powerful position. Someone with zero debt and zero assets is safe, certainly, but also financially stagnant. Safety without growth is simply stagnation wearing a more comfortable disguise. Growth without proper control eventually collapses. Spread, when managed properly, is the balance between ambition and discipline, the bridge connecting the two. Understand this deeply before moving forward. Banks calculate their own risk carefully before lending to you. You need to calculate your spread just as carefully before borrowing from them. If you understand spread better than the bank understands its own risk models, you gain a genuine and lasting advantage, because you are no longer borrowing emotionally. You are borrowing mathematically. And math, unlike people, never panics under pressure. In the next chapter, we are going to explore inflation directly, because inflation is either your silent enemy or your silent ally, and leverage is exactly what determines which side of that equation you end up standing on. Chapter 5: Inflation, the silent enemy or your greatest ally. Inflation is not just rising prices showing up at the grocery store. It is a quiet, ongoing transfer of financial power happening in the background of everyday life. Every single year, quietly and invisibly, your money buys a little less than it did before. Groceries rise, rent rises, construction costs rise, wages eventually catch up, though often slower than everything else. But debt, if it is structured correctly from the start, stays exactly the same. And that gap is precisely where leverage becomes a genuine weapon in your favor. Most people experience inflation purely as pain. They feel squeezed financially. Their cost of living climbs steadily. Their salary often lags behind. Their savings quietly lose purchasing power sitting in a bank account. But asset owners experience inflation in a completely different way, because inflation tends to punish savers while rewarding debt holders, specifically those whose debt is fixed and tied to assets that appreciate over time. Let us walk through this clearly. Imagine you take out a 30-year fixed mortgage. Your payment is $1,500 per month, locked in, stable, completely unchanging for 3 full decades. Now imagine inflation runs at roughly 4 to 5% per year over that period. 10 years from now, that same $1,500 feels noticeably smaller, because your income has likely risen along with everything else. Your rental income has likely risen as well. Your property value has likely climbed too. But your debt payment is still exactly $1,500 per month. Inflation has quietly eroded the real value of your repayment. You are effectively paying off tomorrow's debt using weaker, less valuable dollars. That is not an accident. That is strategic positioning playing out exactly as intended. Now flip that same perspective around. If you simply hold cash, inflation steadily erodes its value with no upside to compensate for the loss. If you avoid all debt entirely, but also fail to acquire any appreciating assets, inflation quietly taxes you anyway, without you even realizing it is happening. This is exactly why wealthy investors tend to love long-term fixed-rate debt during inflationary periods, because they understand something most people never stop to consider. Inflation pushes asset prices upward. Real estate values rise. Businesses raise their prices. Stocks adjust upward over time. But fixed debt stays nominally the same the entire time. That growing gap between the two is where the real power lives. Let us make this tangible with a concrete example. You borrow $300,000 today. 15 years from now, inflation has meaningfully reduced the purchasing power of money in general. That same $300,000 you originally borrowed now feels like considerably less in real terms. But the property you purchased with that money might now be worth $500,000 or $600,000. Rents have climbed steadily. Cash flow has increased along with them. Equity has expanded significantly. Inflation punished the person sitting on cash the entire time, while rewarding the person who held appreciating assets financed with smart, fixed-rate debt. This is not cheating anyone. This is simply understanding how monetary policy actually works in practice. Governments inflate the currency over time. Banks lend that currency out. Investors deploy it strategically. The only real question is whether you are positioned on the defensive side of that process or the offensive side. Now, an important word of caution here. Inflation only genuinely benefits you when several specific conditions are true at once. Your debt needs to be fixed rate. Your asset needs to appreciate in value or produce reliable income. Your cash flow needs to remain positive throughout. Your spread needs to survive whatever interest rate environment comes along. If you are instead holding variable rate debt during a period of rising inflation, your payments can increase right alongside everything else, and your margin shrinks rather than growing. That represents real, tangible risk. This is exactly why structure matters so much. Fixed-rate debt during inflationary periods tends to be strategic. Short-term adjustable debt during genuinely unstable economic cycles can become dangerous fairly quickly. The wealthy do not simply borrow money. They structure how they borrow it deliberately, aligning the duration of their debt with the broader economic cycle they expect to face. They think in terms of years and decades, not months. Here is a deeper truth worth holding on to. Inflation tends to reward scarcity specifically. Assets that are genuinely scarce tend to rise in value faster than everything else around them. Land in desirable, in-demand areas. Cash-flowing properties located in strong, growing cities. Businesses that hold real pricing power in their market. Assets capable of raising their own prices in step with inflation. If you borrow to acquire assets that lack any real pricing power, inflation may not meaningfully help your position at all. If you borrow to acquire assets that naturally adjust upward alongside inflation, you come out ahead consistently. Now let us address something important that many people say out loud without fully thinking it through. I do not want debt. I want peace. But what if properly structured debt is actually what creates lasting peace rather than threatening it? Here is the psychological difference worth understanding. If you rely entirely on your job income alone, inflation pressures you constantly and relentlessly. Your rent rises. Your mortgage rises if it happens to be adjustable. Your overall cost of living climbs steadily. You feel squeezed from every direction at once. But if you own assets financed at favorable fixed rates, your income tends to rise right alongside inflation, while your debt payment stays exactly the same. Your equity grows steadily in the background. Inflation ends up working for you instead of constantly working against you. This is not about chasing inflation aggressively. It is about positioning yourself intelligently within whatever economic cycle is currently unfolding around you. Let us talk briefly about equity growth specifically. Every single mortgage payment you make reduces your principal balance a little further. Every year that passes under inflation tends to increase the underlying asset's value somewhat. This creates a steadily expanding equity gap over time. Equity, in practical terms, represents optionality. Optionality represents genuine freedom. You can refinance when conditions are favorable. You can sell when the timing makes sense. You can leverage again to acquire something new. You can reposition your entire portfolio as circumstances change. Inflation becomes a genuine force multiplier in this process, but only if you actually hold control of appreciating assets to begin with. And control is most often achieved specifically through intelligent leverage. Now let us look at this from another angle entirely. Businesses. If you borrow to acquire or expand a business, and that particular business has the ability to raise its prices in step with inflation, your revenue increases steadily, while your debt payment remains exactly fixed. Your profit margins expand as a direct result. Your real repayment burden effectively shrinks over time. This is precisely how smart entrepreneurs manage to grow their businesses during inflationary periods. They lock in fixed-rate debt early and then let inflation naturally inflate their revenue around that fixed cost. But again, this only works reliably if the spread remains genuinely positive, if cash flow stays strong throughout, and if the underlying risk is being actively managed the entire time. Here is a psychological trap worth being aware of. Many people genuinely panic during periods of rising inflation. They freeze up. They avoid investing entirely out of fear. They hoard cash, believing it offers safety. And that hesitation ends up costing them significantly, because inflation does not pause and wait for anyone to feel comfortable again. It erodes value silently and continuously in the background. Real wealth tends to be built by positioning yourself ahead of major macroeconomic shifts, not by reacting emotionally to whatever headline happens to be dominating the news that particular week. The wealthy understand economic cycles deeply. They do not fight against inflation directly. They learn to harness it instead. Now, here is an important caution worth repeating clearly. Never use inflation as an excuse or justification for reckless, undisciplined borrowing. Inflation functions as a tailwind in your favor. It is not a parachute that will save you from a genuinely bad decision. If the underlying asset itself is weak, inflation will not rescue it. If your overall financial structure is unstable, inflation can actually expose that fragility even more clearly than calm economic conditions would. But when everything is properly structured from the beginning, inflation becomes a largely invisible ally, working quietly in the background. The middle class tends to complain about rising prices. The disciplined investor calculates the opportunity hidden within that same environment. Same exact economic conditions, completely different positioning and outcome. So ask yourself honestly right now, are you currently positioned defensively or offensively when it comes to inflation? Are you simply hoping inflation slows down soon, or are you actually positioned to benefit directly when it continues rising? Because in modern economies, inflation is not some rare anomaly that occasionally happens. It is, in many real ways, an ongoing policy choice, and that policy tends to favor those who already hold real assets. The only remaining question is whether you intend to become one of them. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about something even more powerful than inflation itself: credit positioning. Because real leverage is not simply about borrowing money when you need it. It is about becoming the specific kind of borrower that banks actively compete to lend to. And once the bank starts chasing you instead of the other way around, the entire game changes in your favor. Chapter 6. Become the borrower banks compete for. There is a massive difference between walking into a bank hoping for approval and walking in while lenders compete to offer you their best possible terms. One position is weak, the other is genuinely powerful. Most people approach banks hoping to be approved. The wealthy walk in already negotiating the terms on their side. That single shift changes everything, because real leverage is not just about using loans effectively. It is about becoming the exact kind of borrower that lenders actively fight to finance. Understand this clearly from the start. Credit is a genuine weapon, but only if you know how to sharpen it properly. Banks do not actually fear debt itself. They fear risk. And your entire job in this context is to reduce how risky you appear until lending to you becomes genuinely attractive to them. Let us break this down clearly. When you apply for any loan, the bank is analyzing several specific things: your credit score, your debt-to-income ratio, your available cash reserves, the quality of the asset you are financing, the stability of your income, and your overall exposure to risk. They are not evaluating your dreams or your ambitions. They are evaluating probability. The probability that you will repay reliably. The probability that the asset itself will perform as expected. The probability that they, as the lender, ultimately come out ahead. Your job throughout this entire process is to tilt that probability clearly in your favor. Here is the first mental shift worth making. Stop seeing your credit score as just a number floating somewhere in the background of your financial life. Start seeing it instead as your leverage capacity. A strong credit profile directly lowers your cost of capital. A lower cost of capital directly increases your spread. An increased spread directly accelerates your overall growth. Everything in this system is genuinely connected. Now let us talk about discipline specifically. Pay every single bill on time, every time, without exception, not because it is some kind of moral obligation, but because it is purely strategic. A single late payment can meaningfully increase your future borrowing costs. A higher borrowing cost shrinks your available spread. A smaller spread weakens your overall leverage position. Every single detail genuinely matters here. Let us discuss credit utilization next. High credit utilization signals financial stress to a lender. Low utilization signals genuine control and stability. You want banks to see you as calm, predictable, and financially stable, not stretched thin or desperate for capital. Never max out your available credit lines, even in situations where you technically could. Having available capital sitting in reserve is far more powerful than appearing desperate for capital you do not yet have access to. Next, diversify your credit profile intelligently over time. A healthy mix of installment loans and revolving credit accounts strengthens the overall depth of your financial profile. But do not open new accounts impulsively just to chase that diversity. Every credit inquiry matters. Every new credit line affects your overall structure. The actual goal here is not simply to collect as many credit accounts as possible. The goal is to optimize your genuine borrowing power over time. Now here is something most people completely overlook: liquidity. Cash reserves represent real financial strength. Banks deeply respect borrowers who clearly do not need their money desperately. If you walk into a bank holding zero cash reserves, you appear financially dependent and stretched. If you walk in holding 6 months of living expenses in liquid cash, you appear genuinely controlled and stable. Leverage strongly favors liquidity, because liquidity is exactly what absorbs unexpected financial shocks when they inevitably occur. Let us talk about how you present your income as well. Stable, well-documented income strengthens any loan application significantly. But here is an important strategic layer worth understanding. If you are self-employed, you need to structure your reported income intelligently. Understand clearly how lenders actually evaluate tax returns when assessing your application. Sometimes, aggressively reducing your taxable income for tax purposes can simultaneously reduce your borrowing power when it comes time to qualify for a loan. You have to carefully balance smart tax strategy against your broader leverage strategy. Real wealth building requires a genuinely holistic view of your entire financial picture. Now let us talk about relationships specifically. Larger, more experienced borrowers tend to build real relationships with their lenders over time. They do not simply shop blindly from bank to bank with no continuity. They actively cultivate genuine rapport because relationship-based lending frequently results in noticeably better terms. Better terms translate directly into a lower cost of capital. A lower cost of capital translates into a stronger overall spread. A stronger spread translates directly into faster growth. Notice the pattern here. Everything ultimately loops back to the underlying math. Here is the genuinely powerful shift that happens once you reach this level. When banks are actively competing to lend to you, you get to choose the structure of the deal. You negotiate the rate. You request longer repayment terms when it benefits you. You demand fixed-rate options to protect your margin going forward. That represents real power in the relationship. But here is the honest truth. Most people never reach this stage. Most people misuse credit early in life. They damage their reputation through careless decisions. They chase short-term consumption instead of long-term position. They default on obligations. They overextend themselves financially. And rebuilding from that kind of damage takes years of consistent, disciplined effort. Credit is genuinely slow to build and remarkably fast to damage. Treat it like a financial reputation, because that is precisely what it actually is. Now let us go a layer deeper into the psychology of this. When you know you have reliable access to capital, you think differently as a result. You move differently through opportunities. You negotiate from a fundamentally different position. You spot opportunities faster, because your leverage potential naturally expands your overall vision of what is possible. But never confuse simple access to capital with an obligation to use it. Just because you can borrow does not mean that you should in every situation. Discipline remains the deciding factor at every single stage of this process. Let us talk about strategic timing as well. Borrow when the terms available to you are genuinely favorable. Refinance when interest rates drop meaningfully. Extend your loan duration when inflation favors locking in a fixed structure. Shorten your duration when minimizing total interest becomes the higher priority in a given situation. Borrowing is never a static, one-time decision. It is an ongoing, dynamic process. Wealth builders continuously adjust their approach. Average consumers simply commit blindly and rarely revisit the decision afterward. Here is something genuinely important to remember. Never become emotionally attached to any single lender out of loyalty alone. If genuinely better terms exist somewhere else, move your business there. Loyalty in finance must always serve your own interests, not simple sentiment toward a particular bank. That said, maintain real professionalism throughout this process, because your financial reputation travels with you, especially within the world of business financing specifically. Now let us discuss positioning that goes beyond just your credit score. The assets you already control also strengthen your overall borrowing power over time. If you already hold cash-flowing assets successfully, banks recognize that you have a genuine track record. Demonstrated experience reduces their perceived risk significantly. Your very first deal is always the hardest one to get approved. Your fifth deal becomes noticeably easier by comparison. Momentum compounds steadily over time. Reputation compounds. Trust compounds. Genuinely everything in this process compounds together. Here is the critical question worth asking yourself honestly. Are you actively preparing yourself to borrow intelligently, or are you simply reacting impulsively whenever an opportunity happens to appear in front of you? Preparation always precedes genuine leverage. The wealthy prepare carefully before they ever expand. They strengthen their credit profile before applying for anything. They build up their cash reserves before scaling up their investments. They optimize their overall structure before pursuing any new acquisition. And precisely because they prepare so thoroughly in advance, they are able to move quickly the moment genuine opportunity finally appears. Speed without proper preparation is simply chaos. Preparation is what creates controlled speed, and controlled speed is exactly what builds lasting financial empires over time. Now, understand something genuinely powerful here. Once you reach a certain threshold in this process, banks actually begin wanting your business, specifically because you have proven yourself to be profitable, reliable, and predictable. That fundamentally flips the entire power dynamic in your favor. You are no longer simply asking for permission to borrow. You are actively structuring partnerships on your own terms. And that particular psychological shift is genuinely significant. The bank transforms from being a gatekeeper, standing in your way, into becoming a genuine fuel source, supporting your continued growth. But we are not finished yet, because having access to capital alone means relatively little without intelligently deploying that capital afterward. In the next chapter, we are going to talk specifically about deploying borrowed money into assets that genuinely compound over time, because access to capital by itself does not create real wealth. Thoughtful execution is what actually does. Chapter 7. Deploying debt into compounding machines. Access to capital means almost nothing if you do not know exactly where to place it. Leverage only becomes genuinely powerful when it is directed into something capable of compounding over time. And compounding, in many real ways, functions as the eighth wonder of financial engineering, because compounding does something genuinely remarkable. It turns time itself into an ally. It turns ordinary patience into real momentum. It turns simple discipline into exponential growth over the long run. But here is the brutal truth most people never confront directly. Most people who borrow money never actually experience meaningful compounding because they deploy their borrowed capital into static, unmoving assets, or worse, into liabilities that quietly depreciate over time. You need to understand this clearly. Not every single asset genuinely compounds. Some assets simply produce income, some appreciate slowly in value, some merely keep pace with inflation, but only a select few truly compound in the meaningful sense of the word. And if you are going to take on debt at all, you should be borrowing specifically to acquire compounding engines. Let us define compounding clearly and precisely. Compounding happens when an asset produces income. That income gets reinvested. That reinvestment produces additional income on top of the original amount, and the entire cycle accelerates naturally from there. This is genuine financial acceleration in action. Picture two different investors side by side. Investor A buys a property that barely manages to break even every month. Investor B buys a property that generates strong, reliable, positive cash flow from day one. Investor A simply waits patiently for appreciation in value to eventually arrive. Investor B actively reinvests their monthly profit as it comes in. After 5 years pass, Investor B genuinely owns more because their cash flow has been compounding the entire time. Investor A, by contrast, mostly owns hope, and hope, unfortunately, does not compound. Cash flow does. Let us break down the actual categories of genuine compounding machines available to most investors. First, cash-flowing real estate. Rental properties that generate real monthly profit beyond their debt obligations. That profit becomes seed capital. Seed capital funds your next acquisition. New acquisitions increase your overall cash flow. Increased cash flow accelerates your continued expansion. If structured correctly from the start, this becomes a genuinely self-fueling growth engine over time. Second, scalable businesses, specifically businesses that can grow their revenue without a proportional increase in expenses. Software products, digital products, and service-based systems with genuinely strong profit margins all fall into this category. When borrowed capital is used to expand these particular operations, revenue tends to scale faster than the associated costs. Profit margins widen as a result. Spread increases. Reinvestment accelerates the entire cycle further. Third, dividend-producing investments. Stable investments that generate consistent, predictable income over time. You reinvest the dividends received. You compound your overall position size. You compound your effective yield over the years. But an important caution belongs here. Borrowing to invest specifically in volatile markets requires real, serious discipline. Your spread needs to be genuinely solid. The volatility involved needs to remain tolerable. Margin calls absolutely need to be avoided at all costs. Fourth, intellectual property, books, online courses, licensing agreements, and digital media of various kinds. These genuinely require real sweat equity to build initially. But when scaled using borrowed capital for marketing or further expansion, they have the potential to compound quite dramatically over time. Here is the core underlying principle running through all of these categories. You want assets where income tends to grow steadily over time, expenses remain reasonably predictable, your debt stays fixed, and underlying demand remains genuinely durable. Durability genuinely matters here. Compounding fundamentally requires time to work properly, and time itself requires real underlying stability to function correctly. Now, let us address something genuinely dangerous, worth avoiding entirely. Borrowing specifically into passing trends. Trends often feel exciting and full of momentum in the moment, but genuine compounding requires consistency above all else. Speculative assets may spike dramatically for a period, but spikes simply do not compound reliably over time. Reliability is what genuinely builds lasting empires. Spikes mostly just build interesting stories to share. Stories, unfortunately, do not build real financial freedom. Here is a genuinely powerful strategic move worth adopting. Use debt specifically to accelerate your initial entry into an opportunity. Then use the resulting cash flow to accelerate your continued expansion from there. For example, you acquire one genuinely strong asset using leverage. It generates $15,000 in positive annual spread. Instead of spending that money right away, you save it carefully until you have accumulated another down payment. You acquire again. You repeat this entire process. This represents controlled compounding done correctly. Here is the critical difference, separating amateurs from genuine professionals in this space. Amateurs tend to consume their profits as they arrive. Professionals consistently reinvest their profits instead. If your leveraged asset produces $1,000 per month and you simultaneously increase your personal lifestyle spending by that same $1,000 per month, you have effectively neutralized your leverage entirely. If you reinvest that same $1,000 instead, you have genuinely activated real compounding. Discipline alone determines which outcome you ultimately experience. Let us discuss velocity briefly as well. The velocity of money refers to how quickly your capital moves from profit back into reinvestment. High velocity accelerates compounding noticeably, but reckless velocity, pursued without proper care, significantly increases overall risk. Balance genuinely matters here. Imagine you build 3 separate properties, each one generating a positive spread reliably. You now have genuinely stable cash flow coming in consistently. Instead of immediately acquiring 5 additional properties all at once, you strengthen your reserves first, improve your existing systems, reduce your current risk exposure, and only then expand further from that stronger position. This represents controlled acceleration done properly. Now let us talk about debt layering specifically. Never layer speculative debt directly on top of unstable cash flow that is already shaky to begin with. Each new leveraged position you take on needs to be supported by genuinely stable underlying income. The overall structure should feel solidly strong, never uncomfortably stretched thin. Remember clearly that compounding tends to collapse, specifically when a structure becomes overextended. Margin functions as your protection. Liquidity functions as your armor against unexpected shocks. Here is something genuinely powerful worth understanding clearly. Compounding fundamentally requires real patience to work properly. The first year of this process often feels frustratingly slow. The second year builds only slightly on top of that. By year 5, things genuinely begin accelerating. By year 10, the results can feel almost explosive by comparison. But most people quit well before that acceleration ever has a chance to arrive. They expect immediate, dramatic transformation right from the start. Real wealth rarely moves dramatically in its early stages. It builds quietly at first, then suddenly all at once later on. This is precisely why discipline ultimately matters more than excitement throughout this entire process. Now let us talk honestly about emotional control specifically. Once compounding genuinely begins working, temptation naturally increases right alongside it. You start seeing real profit arrive. You feel a genuine sense of success building. You want to upgrade your lifestyle as a direct result. But the wealthy consistently delay that particular gratification because they clearly understand this important truth. Early lifestyle upgrades quietly kill long-term exponential growth before it ever has the chance to fully develop. Reinvest early in the process. Upgrade your lifestyle later, once the foundation is genuinely secure. That is the actual formula that works. Here is a deeper concept worth fully internalizing. Debt plus compounding plus sufficient time together equals genuine asymmetry. Asymmetry specifically means limited downside risk paired with potentially massive upside opportunity. If your underlying asset is cash flow positive from the start, your downside risk remains genuinely controlled throughout. Your upside potential remains exponential over time. This represents genuinely intelligent risk-taking, properly understood. Now let us talk about long-term vision specifically. Ask yourself honestly whether a given asset is genuinely compounding steadily over 10 years, or simply peaking quickly within just 2. Is the underlying market genuinely stable? Is demand for this asset truly consistent over time? Is the overall structure genuinely durable? Compounding, in practice, tends to favor assets that are somewhat boring on the surface. Boring assets compound the most reliably over time. Flashy, exciting assets tend to fluctuate wildly by comparison. And fluctuation, by its very nature, disrupts the steady process of compounding. Here is a genuinely valuable strategic insight worth holding on to. Once your particular compounding engine grows sufficiently large, you no longer need to rely on aggressive leverage to keep growing. The system itself begins funding its own continued expansion. At that particular stage, debt becomes genuinely optional rather than necessary. But to actually reach that stage in the first place, you need to deploy debt intelligently during the earlier phases of this process. Now understand this clearly as we close out this chapter. Leverage functions as the spark that gets things started. Compounding functions as the engine that drives everything forward. Time functions as the essential fuel powering the entire process. Discipline functions as the driver steering everything in the right direction. And emotion, unfortunately, tends to function as the enemy threatening to derail the entire system at any given moment. In the next chapter, we are going to address something genuinely critical: the psychological war that comes along with debt. Because numbers alone do not ultimately determine whether you succeed with this entire approach. Your ability to control fear, greed, and ego absolutely does. And without genuine psychological mastery in place, even the most intelligent leverage strategy can still collapse under real pressure. Chapter 8: The Psychological War of Debt. Before debt ever breaks your bank account, it breaks your mind first. Before leverage ever destroys your balance sheet, it destabilizes your emotions long before that. This is the part of the conversation that almost nobody talks about openly. The math can be absolutely perfect. The spread can be genuinely positive. The structure can be intelligently designed from the start. But if your psychology is weak underneath all of that, you will eventually sabotage yourself, because debt amplifies exactly who you already are as a person. If you are naturally disciplined, debt magnifies that discipline. If you are naturally impulsive, debt magnifies that impulsiveness right alongside it. If you tend toward fear, debt magnifies that fear significantly. If you tend toward greed, debt magnifies that greed just as powerfully. And leverage, in general, does not forgive emotional instability of any kind. Let us talk about fear first, since it tends to affect the largest number of people. Fear of debt keeps many people permanently small in their financial life. They avoid leverage of any kind entirely. They refuse to borrow under almost any circumstance. They cling tightly to a sense of safety above everything else. But safety without any meaningful growth eventually leads to genuine stagnation over time. The fear-driven investor never truly expands, never genuinely scales, never compounds in any meaningful way. They feel secure in the moment, certainly, but inflation slowly erodes their position in the background. Opportunities quietly pass them by entirely. Time itself eventually outruns them while they wait for certainty that never fully arrives. Now let us talk about the completely opposite extreme, overconfidence. This particular trap is actually more dangerous in many ways. You experience some early success in this process. One property performs noticeably well. One business scales quickly and impressively. You begin feeling genuinely invincible as a result. You expand aggressively without much hesitation. You stack additional debt rapidly on top of your existing positions. You ignore the importance of margin entirely. You underestimate the genuine risks involved. And then, suddenly, one unexpected market shift shakes the entire structure at once. Confidence quickly turns into outright panic. Panic turns directly into forced selling at the worst possible moment. And forced selling, under pressure, genuinely destroys real wealth that took years to build. Both fear and greed function as genuine enemies in this process. The actual goal you should be working toward is emotional neutrality. You must learn to treat debt purely as a tool, not as a thrill to chase, and not as a threat to fear constantly. Simply a tool. The wealthy tend to be genuinely boring with their money in this specific sense. They do not celebrate taking on loans. They do not dramatize their monthly payments emotionally. They calculate the numbers carefully. They execute their plan. They adjust calmly when needed. Let us discuss stress tolerance specifically. If you cannot personally tolerate temporary fluctuations in your financial position, leverage will genuinely test you repeatedly over time. Markets dip periodically. Vacancies occur from time to time. Interest rates shift unpredictably. News headlines regularly scream about impending recession. If your psychology genuinely collapses during these normal periods of volatility, you end up making poor decisions as a direct result. You sell assets at exactly the wrong time. You refinance under poor terms out of panic. You liquidate positions impulsively out of fear. The wealthy, by contrast, do not react emotionally to surrounding noise. They calmly analyze their underlying structure instead. If that structure remains genuinely sound, they remain calm throughout the disruption. Calm wins consistently over time. Emotion tends to lose. Here is a genuinely powerful truth worth holding on to. Debt, by its very nature, forces a certain level of maturity. When you sign a loan agreement, you are formally committing to real responsibility. If you treat that commitment casually or carelessly, you will eventually suffer the consequences. If you treat it with genuine respect instead, you grow noticeably stronger as a result. Debt, in many ways, functions as discipline training. It forces you to track your numbers carefully. It forces you to manage your cash flow attentively. It forces you to build proper reserves. It forces you to control unnecessary spending. If you borrow without any real discipline in place, debt quickly becomes chaos. But if you borrow with genuine discipline from the start, debt becomes structure instead. And structure, over time, creates real strength. Let us return to the topic of ego once more, because ego does not simply disappear after you make your initial acquisition. Ego continues whispering quietly throughout the entire growth process that follows. It tells you that you are successful now, that you deserve more as a result, that you should scale even faster, that you should upgrade your lifestyle immediately. And if you listen to that voice too quickly, you interrupt the compounding process before it has fully matured. Emotional spending genuinely kills leverage efficiency over time. That extra $3,000 per month in profit, if spent immediately on lifestyle upgrades, simply disappears without a trace. If reinvested instead, it multiplies steadily over time. Here is a question you genuinely need to answer honestly with yourself. Why exactly do you want leverage in the first place? If your honest answer is status, you are genuinely vulnerable to making poor decisions down the road. If your honest answer is freedom, you are genuinely grounded in your approach. Freedom-focused investors tend to move strategically and deliberately. Status-focused investors tend to move emotionally instead, and emotional leverage, sooner or later, tends to collapse under its own weight. Now let us talk about comparison specifically, because it quietly distorts financial clarity more than people realize. Debt feels noticeably heavier when you constantly compare your situation to other people's. You see someone who is completely debt-free and suddenly feel insecure about your own choices. You see someone else scaling aggressively and suddenly feel like you are falling behind. Comparison genuinely distorts your sense of clarity. Focus instead on your own structure, your own margin, your own spread, your own reserves, and your own personal timeline. Building real wealth is not a competitive race against other people. It is closer to careful engineering, applied consistently over time. Here is a subtle psychological trap worth understanding clearly. When markets are rising, confidence naturally tends to rise right along with them. When markets fall, fear tends to rise instead. But both of those emotional states are ultimately temporary. Solid structure outlasts both kinds of market cycles over time. If your leverage is built on genuinely positive cash flow, strong cash reserves, fixed-rate terms, and durable underlying demand, you will survive downturns when they come. If it is built instead on speculation, minimal reserves, excessive exposure, and ego-driven expansion, you will genuinely suffer when conditions eventually shift. Psychological strength, in practice, tends to come directly from structural strength. Build your underlying balance sheet to be genuinely strong, and your emotions will naturally follow that same stability over time. Now let us discuss patience specifically. Leverage has a tendency to magnify any existing impatience you already carry. If you expect quick, dramatic transformation right from the start, you will likely feel genuine disappointment along the way. If you expect long-term compounding instead, you will feel genuine stability throughout the process. Patience tends to stabilize your overall psychology. Impatience tends to destabilize it considerably. Remember clearly that debt accelerates growth, but it does not eliminate the role of time entirely. Time still does the vast majority of the heavy lifting in this process. You cannot force compounding to happen faster than it naturally does. You can only position yourself properly to benefit from it when it eventually arrives. Here is another important psychological factor worth mentioning: isolation. When you begin using leverage intelligently and deliberately, many people around you genuinely will not understand what you are doing or why. They may criticize your choices openly. They may warn you repeatedly about the risks involved. They may unknowingly project their own personal fears onto your decisions. You need to filter the advice you receive carefully and thoughtfully. Take genuine input, specifically from people who actually understand financial structure deeply, not simply from people who only understand caution in a general sense. Caution without real underlying knowledge tends to create stagnation. Knowledge paired with appropriate caution tends to create genuine power instead. Now here is the real underlying battlefield in all of this: maintaining control over your own consumption habits. When your income increases as a direct result of successful leverage, temptation naturally increases right alongside it. And this is precisely where most investors ultimately fail in this process. They confuse early profit with permanent, lasting wealth. They increase their personal expenses. They reduce how much they reinvest. They slow down their own compounding process without fully realizing it. This represents genuine psychological leakage happening quietly in the background. You need to remain genuinely disciplined for longer than feels naturally comfortable, because real wealth tends to compound slowly at first, then suddenly, all at once, later on. Now understand something genuinely critical as we close this chapter. Your overall relationship with debt needs to remain neutral throughout this entire process. Not emotional, not prideful, not filled with shame either. Simply neutral. Debt itself is neither inherently evil nor inherently heroic. It is, at its core, simply arithmetic. And arithmetic, by its very nature, does not care about your feelings in any way. It responds consistently and predictably to structure alone. In the next chapter, we are going to move into the topic of strategic repayment specifically, because at a certain point, your relationship with leverage genuinely needs to evolve. Debt eventually needs to be repositioned. Your terms eventually need to be adjusted. And knowing precisely when to hold debt versus when to eliminate it entirely represents the final layer of true mastery in this entire process. Chapter 9. When to hold debt and when to kill it. There comes a moment in every wealth-building journey when the underlying question genuinely shifts. At first, you ask yourself, how do I get approved for this loan? How do I deploy leverage effectively? How do I expand my position? But later on, a smarter question naturally emerges instead. Should I actually still be holding this particular debt at all? Because leverage, properly understood, is a phase in your financial journey, not a permanent religion you commit to forever. Knowing precisely when to hold debt and when to eliminate it entirely marks the true sign of genuine financial maturity. Let us be genuinely clear about something important here. Debt is a tool used for acceleration. It is not meant to be a permanent identity you carry forever. In the early stages of building real wealth, leverage helps you compress time significantly. It allows you to control assets you otherwise could not have accessed on your own. It multiplies your overall financial footprint. It expands your genuine influence and reach. But as your assets mature over time, as your equity steadily builds, and as your cash flow gradually stabilizes, your overall strategy naturally needs to evolve right alongside those changes. Here is the common mistake many investors make in this exact area. They either avoid debt completely out of fear, or they hold on to debt indefinitely, purely out of stubborn pride. Both of these extremes genuinely lack the nuance required here, and nuance, in this particular context, represents real power. Let us break this down strategically into clear stages. There are generally 3 distinct stages within any genuine wealth-building journey involving leverage. Stage 1 is acquisition debt. Stage 2 is optimization debt. Stage 3 is optional debt. Stage 1, acquisition debt, occurs when you are actively borrowing in order to enter new markets and opportunities. You use leverage specifically to gain meaningful control. You focus primarily on your overall spread. You prioritize compounding above almost everything else. You remain aggressive, but always calculated in your approach. At this particular stage, debt functions purely as fuel. Stage 2, optimization debt, arrives once your existing assets have become genuinely stable. Your cash flow has become consistent and predictable. Your equity has grown meaningfully over time. At this particular stage, you begin analyzing your existing structure more carefully. Is this specific debt still genuinely optimal for my situation? Could I refinance into noticeably better terms? Could I extend the overall duration of this loan? Could I lower my effective interest rate? Could I improve my underlying cash flow further? You are no longer simply chasing blind expansion at this stage. You are actively refining your existing structure instead. Now comes the stage that represents genuine mastery. Stage 3, optional debt. This is the stage that many investors, unfortunately, never actually reach. At this particular stage, your assets are producing genuinely strong cash flow on a consistent basis. Your equity position has become substantial. Your cash reserves are genuinely healthy. You no longer need leverage simply to survive or to continue expanding your position. Debt, at this point, becomes fully optional rather than necessary. And true optionality, in this specific financial sense, represents real freedom. Here is the meaningful psychological difference between these stages. When debt feels necessary, it tends to feel genuinely heavy and burdensome. When debt becomes truly optional instead, it feels strategic and intentional rather than oppressive. Now let us discuss, specifically, when it makes sense to eliminate debt entirely. You should generally eliminate debt when your spread effectively disappears, when the interest rate on the loan clearly exceeds the actual return your asset is producing, when the underlying risk genuinely outweighs the potential reward, when personal peace of mind becomes more valuable to you than continued leverage. If you are holding debt at 9% interest and your underlying asset is only returning 6%, you are actively losing spread every single month. That particular debt should genuinely be eliminated as soon as practically possible. If you happen to be approaching retirement and overall stability matters more to you at that stage than continued growth, reducing your leverage generally makes good sense. If increasing market volatility is raising your overall risk exposure significantly, deliberately deleveraging can genuinely help protect your position. But here is the key principle running through all of this. You eliminate debt strategically and deliberately, never purely out of emotional reaction. Let us talk specifically about interest rate math in this context. If you happen to be carrying a loan fixed at 3%, while inflation is running closer to 5%, and your underlying asset is producing solid cash flow, why would you rush to eliminate that particular debt? That loan is genuinely cheap money working in your favor. In fact, it may actually be beneficial to continue holding it rather than paying it down early. But if you are instead carrying high-interest consumer debt, credit cards sitting at 18%, or personal loans charging 12%, there is genuinely no real debate to be had here. Eliminate that debt immediately. That particular kind of debt is not leverage in any meaningful sense. It is simply financial leakage draining your overall position. Here is a deeper insight, worth understanding clearly. The wealthy frequently choose to refinance their debt rather than simply repay it outright. They reposition their existing debt strategically rather than eliminating it entirely. For example, imagine you own a property currently worth $600,000 while you still owe $200,000 on the mortgage. Rather than rushing to pay off that $200,000 immediately, you might instead choose to refinance strategically, pull out some of your built-up equity, use that capital to acquire a new asset, and meaningfully increase your overall compounding, but only if the resulting spread remains genuinely positive throughout that process. Debt, in this case, gets repositioned thoughtfully rather than blindly destroyed without any real strategic consideration. But there does come a genuine moment when compounding has fully done its work over time, when your existing assets generate considerably more income than you actually need, when your personal tolerance for financial stress has genuinely shifted over the years, When your broader lifestyle priorities have meaningfully changed as a result of everything you have built. At that particular point, you may genuinely choose to eliminate your remaining debt entirely, not because you absolutely must, but simply because you finally can. And that particular psychological shift, choosing freedom rather than being forced into it, carries real and lasting power. Let us briefly discuss something called debt fatigue. Holding debt over the long term genuinely requires sustained discipline throughout. Even objectively good debt still carries ongoing responsibility with it. Some investors eventually reach a stage where their cash flow is genuinely strong, their overall net worth is substantial, and the marginal additional benefit of continuing to hold leverage becomes relatively small in comparison. At that particular point, genuine peace of mind may reasonably outweigh continued expansion as a priority. This represents healthy evolution in your financial journey, not weakness or failure on your part. But here is an important warning worth repeating clearly. Never eliminate genuinely productive debt too early in your journey. If paying off a loan charging 4% interest prevents you from instead acquiring a new asset capable of returning 10%, you have unnecessarily slowed your own growth in the process. You always need to carefully analyze the genuine opportunity cost involved. Every single dollar you use specifically to pay down existing debt is a dollar that cannot simultaneously be deployed elsewhere for potentially greater benefit. Opportunity cost genuinely needs to be calculated carefully before making these decisions. Now let us discuss the concept of strategic debt snowballing specifically. You generally prioritize paying down your highest interest debt first, followed by moderate interest debt, and finally your lowest interest debt last. But you should always continue evaluating one key question throughout this process. Does this particular debt still genuinely serve my overall spread? If the honest answer is yes, you may reasonably choose to keep it in place. If the honest answer is no, you should remove it from your overall structure. Here is a subtle psychological trap worth being genuinely aware of. Some people rush to eliminate all of their debt simply because doing so feels emotionally satisfying in the moment. Being completely debt-free certainly sounds powerful when you say it out loud. But sometimes that particular choice is genuinely financially suboptimal when you look closely at the actual numbers involved. Once again, this comes down to emotion versus pure arithmetic. And arithmetic generally wins out in these situations when you take the time to look closely. Let us picture two different investors to illustrate this clearly. Investor A aggressively pays off all of their mortgages as quickly as possible. Investor B instead keeps their low-interest mortgages in place and reinvests their available profit elsewhere. 10 years later, Investor B frequently ends up controlling considerably more assets overall, more total cash flow, and more accumulated equity, specifically because leverage amplified their compounding the entire time. That said, if market conditions happen to shift unfavorably during that period, Investor A may genuinely feel more stable and secure by comparison. Neither approach is universally correct in every single situation. Your specific context matters here. Your individual goals matter. Your personal timeline matters considerably as well. Here is the single most important question worth asking yourself honestly at this point. What particular stage are you currently in within your own financial journey? Early-stage wealth builders should generally focus their attention on deploying intelligent leverage. Mid-stage wealth builders should focus primarily on optimizing their existing structure. Late-stage wealth builders may reasonably choose to prioritize overall stability above continued aggressive growth. No single strategy genuinely fits every person at every stage. Real financial maturity means continuously adjusting your approach as your circumstances naturally evolve over time. In the next chapter, we are going to talk specifically about diversification through leverage, because once your very first compounding engine has become genuinely stable, you absolutely must avoid concentration risk going forward. And concentration risk happens to be exactly where many promising financial empires ultimately collapse. Chapter 10. Diversify or collapse. The leverage expansion rule. Leverage builds genuine empires. Concentration tends to destroy them eventually. There is a particular moment in nearly every investor's journey when early success quietly becomes dangerous. The first asset performs well. The second one performs even better than expected. Cash flow steadily increases. Confidence naturally rises along with it. Momentum continues building. And then, complacency begins whispering quietly in the background. You figured this out already. Just repeat the exact same approach again. Double down on what is clearly working. And that particular moment is precisely when real risk begins hiding in plain sight. Because leverage, by its very nature, magnifies concentration risk significantly. If every single piece of your debt is tied to one specific asset class, one particular city, one narrow market, one single industry, or one single income stream, you are genuinely exposed, not necessarily weak, but exposed nonetheless. And that particular exposure is not always obvious while markets continue rising steadily. It becomes painfully obvious the moment those same markets eventually shift in the other direction. Let us talk specifically about diversification here, not the watered-down, generic version most people think of, and not random, unfocused investing either. We are talking about genuinely strategic diversification. Diversification, properly understood, is not about simply owning a little bit of everything you can find. It is specifically about reducing correlated risk across your overall portfolio. If every single one of your properties happens to be located in one particular neighborhood, a local economic downturn affects all of them simultaneously. If every single one of your businesses depends heavily on one major client, a single cancellation can collapse your entire revenue stream overnight. If every single one of your investments depends on one particular industry, a single disruption within that industry threatens your entire balance sheet at once. Genuine diversification spreads your leverage intelligently across these different categories. But here is an important distinction worth understanding clearly. Diversification attempted without real underlying mastery, simply creates chaos. You need to diversify specifically from a position of genuine strength, not from a place of confusion or uncertainty. Let us break this process down into clear strategic phases. Phase 1 involves what we might call concentrated competence. You master one particular asset class, one specific system, one clear structure first. You genuinely learn how that particular asset behaves over time. You come to understand its cash flow patterns, its typical risk profile, and its natural cycles. You build a genuine foundation of real expertise. Phase 2 involves controlled expansion from that established foundation. Once your position has become genuinely stable, you expand thoughtfully into adjacent opportunities, never randomly, but always strategically. For example, if you currently own residential rental properties, perhaps you add a small commercial property next. If you currently operate a service-based business, perhaps you add a complementary digital product. If you currently hold dividend-paying stocks, perhaps you add real estate investment trusts to round out your portfolio. Notice something genuinely important here. These represent complementary moves, working together, not chaotic, unrelated jumps into unfamiliar territory. Diversification, done properly, should genuinely reduce your overall risk rather than increasing it unnecessarily. Now, let us talk specifically about correlation between different assets. If inflation rises significantly, real estate may genuinely benefit as a result. If interest rates rise aggressively, certain equities may suffer as a consequence. If one particular sector weakens, another sector may simultaneously strengthen in response. Genuine diversification smooths out volatility across your overall portfolio. But here is a common mistake many people make in this exact area. They over-diversify far too early in their journey. They end up owning tiny pieces of far too many different things. They lose meaningful control over their overall position. They dilute their focus unnecessarily. Focus is genuinely what builds your initial wealth in the first place. Diversification is what protects your wealth once it has fully matured. Timing genuinely matters significantly here. Now let us discuss leverage stacking, specifically across different asset classes. Picture this particular structure. Your rental properties produce reliable monthly cash flow. Your digital business produces genuinely scalable income on top of that. Your dividend portfolio produces consistent quarterly income as well. Each individual asset feeds your overall cash reserves. Each one strengthens your available liquidity. Each one reduces your overall reliance on any single income stream. That represents genuinely diversified leverage in action. If real estate happens to slow down temporarily, your digital business continues performing. If your digital business slows down instead, your dividend income continues flowing steadily. If dividends happen to slow temporarily, your rental cash flow remains stable throughout. This kind of redundancy genuinely creates resilience, and resilience, in turn, protects your overall leverage position. Here is a deeper insight worth understanding clearly. Debt itself can also be diversified meaningfully. A mix of fixed-rate and variable-rate loans. A mix of different lenders rather than relying on just one. A mix of secured and unsecured credit. Why does this matter so much? Because relying entirely on one single funding source represents a genuine vulnerability in your overall position. If one particular bank suddenly tightens its lending standards, you still have other viable options available to you. Having options, in this context, genuinely represents real power. Let us discuss concentration risk, specifically as it relates to leverage itself. If you happen to refinance everything you own all at once, and interest rates spike unexpectedly during that same period, you genuinely feel that impact across your entire portfolio simultaneously. If all of your various loans happen to mature at the exact same time, you face significant rollover risk all at once. The solution here is to stagger your maturity dates deliberately. Distribute your overall exposure thoughtfully. Plan ahead with real intention. Genuine professionals deliberately ladder their debt maturities over time. They simply do not allow everything to come due within the same calendar year. Why does this matter so much? Because maintaining genuine flexibility throughout this process is critically important. Now let us address something we might call psychological diversification specifically. If your entire sense of identity becomes tied to one single asset, emotion inevitably begins clouding your decision-making process. If you own only a single business, every downturn within that business feels genuinely catastrophic to you personally. If you instead own multiple income streams simultaneously, the pressure on any single one of them becomes significantly reduced. Reduced pressure, in turn, genuinely improves your overall decision-making ability. Here is something genuinely powerful worth understanding here. Diversification allows you to take calculated risks elsewhere in your portfolio, specifically because your downside in any single area becomes properly absorbed by the rest of your overall structure. If you already know with confidence that your base level of cash flow remains genuinely stable, you can afford to experiment more strategically in other areas. Innovation becomes genuinely possible under these conditions. Without that underlying stability in place, experimentation instead becomes recklessness. Let us discuss scaling intelligently as well. Once your initial compounding engine has become genuinely strong and stable, resist the urge to immediately triple your overall position size. Instead, add one adjacent pillar to your existing structure. Allow that addition to stabilize fully, and only then continue expanding further from that newly strengthened position. Controlled, deliberate expansion consistently beats aggressive, rapid stacking over time, because genuine leverage tends to favor balance above almost everything else. Now here is a genuinely harsh truth worth confronting directly. Many investors ultimately collapse, not because they chose objectively bad assets, but because they became overconfident in relying on a single system or approach. They genuinely believed that one particular model would continue working indefinitely, forever. But markets inevitably change over time. Technology disrupts existing industries regularly. Regulations shift unpredictably. Genuine diversification anticipates this kind of ongoing uncertainty. It does not attempt to predict exactly what will happen. It simply prepares thoughtfully for whatever eventually does happen. Here is the real secret, hiding underneath all of this. True diversification is not solely about the assets themselves. It is equally about diversifying your own underlying skills and knowledge. If you already understand real estate deeply, take the time to also learn solid business fundamentals. If you already understand financial markets well, take the time to learn proper cash flow modeling. If you already understand investing broadly, take the time to learn genuine risk management principles. Diversifying your own knowledge base genuinely strengthens your overall structural diversification as well. The wealthy are not simply diverse across different asset types. They are genuinely diverse across different areas of knowledge, and that broader knowledge base significantly reduces their overall blind spots over time. Now let us discuss defensive positioning specifically. When markets begin feeling genuinely overheated, increase your available liquidity in response. When markets eventually crash, deploy that same liquidity strategically to take advantage of the resulting opportunities. Diversification, properly maintained, gives you the genuine flexibility to act decisively when these moments arrive. Without that underlying diversification in place, most people simply freeze instead. Flexibility, over the long term, consistently wins out. In the next chapter, we are going to discuss something even more subtle than diversification itself: the genuine role that timing plays within the broader context of leverage. Because knowing precisely when to enter a particular opportunity, when to pause and wait, when to refinance strategically, and when to expand further, is exactly where real strategic intelligence ultimately lives. Chapter 11. Timing the market versus timing your structure. There is a genuinely dangerous obsession that exists throughout the financial world. Is this the right time to buy? Are interest rates currently too high? Is the market overheated right now? Should I simply wait a bit longer? And while everyone around you continues arguing endlessly about timing the broader market, the wealthy tend to focus on something far more powerful instead: timing their own personal structure. Because markets inevitably move through natural cycles, but your underlying structure is what ultimately determines whether you survive those cycles intact. Let us make this point genuinely clear from the start. You cannot perfectly time the broader market. That is simply not realistically possible for anyone. But you absolutely can control your own preparation with real precision. And preparation, in practice, consistently beats prediction every single time. Most people delay taking meaningful action while they wait indefinitely for ideal conditions to arrive. Low interest rates, strong appreciation forecasts, generally bullish headlines in the news. But genuinely perfect conditions only ever become clearly visible after the fact, in hindsight. By the time real certainty finally appears, the actual opportunity has typically already moved on without you. The wealthy do not wait around for perfection to arrive. Instead, they build flexible financial structures specifically designed to work reasonably well across multiple different economic cycles. Let us break down these economic cycles clearly: expansion, peak, contraction, and recovery. Every market moves naturally through these four distinct phases over time. But leverage behaves quite differently depending on which particular phase you currently find yourself in. During the expansion phase, credit tends to be relatively cheap, confidence runs generally high, asset values rise steadily, and borrowing becomes noticeably easier. This is precisely the phase where many investors become genuinely reckless. They expand aggressively without much hesitation. They simply assume that the current momentum will continue indefinitely into the future. But expansion, by its very nature, is never truly permanent. During the peak phase, asset prices often feel completely unstoppable to most observers. Greed becomes genuinely widespread throughout the market. Overall risk tolerance becomes significantly inflated beyond reasonable levels. This is precisely the phase where genuinely disciplined investors begin deliberately slowing down. They do not necessarily stop investing entirely, but they become considerably more selective in their choices. During the contraction phase, fear tends to spread quickly throughout the market. Asset prices generally soften, available credit tightens noticeably, and quietly, genuine opportunities begin emerging in the background. This is precisely the phase where well-prepared investors deploy their available capital strategically. Because while everyone else around them is panicking, they are instead acquiring quality assets at meaningful discounts. During the recovery phase, overall confidence gradually rebuilds across the market. General stability slowly returns. Early movers who position themselves correctly during the contraction phase tend to benefit significantly during this recovery period. Genuine timing, in this broader context, is far less about precisely predicting each individual phase, and far more about thoroughly preparing yourself for whichever phase eventually arrives. Here is a genuinely powerful truth worth internalizing here. If your particular leverage strategy only functions well during periods of market expansion, that represents weak leverage by definition. If your leverage strategy can genuinely survive periods of contraction intact, that represents intelligent leverage instead. Structure, in this sense, consistently matters more than precise timing ever could. Now let us talk specifically about interest rates themselves. People tend to obsess constantly over whether current rates are too high. But high relative to what exact benchmark? Interest rates fluctuate considerably throughout history, sometimes sitting around 3%, sometimes closer to 7%, and sometimes considerably higher still. The genuinely important question is never simply whether the current rate happens to be low. The truly important question is whether your overall spread still works at that particular rate. If you borrow at 7% interest, but your underlying asset yields 12% in return, your spread remains clearly positive throughout. If you borrow at 3% instead, but your asset only yields 2%, your spread is actually negative despite the seemingly attractive low rate. Low interest rates alone do not automatically guarantee a genuinely good investment opportunity. High interest rates alone do not automatically eliminate worthwhile opportunities either. Your spread is ultimately what decides genuine viability here. Here is exactly where timing becomes genuinely strategic in practice. If current rates happen to be elevated but fixed, while inflation is simultaneously rising, locking in that fixed-rate debt can actually prove quite powerful over time. If rates happen to be only temporarily elevated for the moment, you may reasonably choose to refinance later once conditions improve. Structure your approach with built-in flexibility. Never structure your approach around simple, unfounded hope. Now let us discuss entry timing specifically, because there are two genuinely dangerous mindsets that tend to trap most investors. The first dangerous mindset says, "I absolutely must buy right now before I miss out entirely." The second dangerous mindset says, "I must wait patiently until every single condition becomes perfectly aligned." Instead, ask yourself a more useful question. Does this particular deal genuinely work under reasonably conservative assumptions? Does it produce positive cash flow at today's current rates? Does it genuinely survive proper stress testing under pressure? If the honest answer is yes, move forward confidently. If the honest answer is no, wait patiently instead. Waiting specifically until your structure properly aligns represents genuine discipline. Waiting indefinitely for the news headlines to simply improve represents pure procrastination instead. Here is a deeper principle worth understanding clearly. Genuine opportunity tends to increase noticeably during periods of widespread fear, but that same fear simultaneously paralyzes anyone who happens to be unprepared at that moment. This is precisely why liquidity matters so much throughout this entire process. When markets contract significantly, lenders naturally tighten their standards, asset prices adjust downward, and genuinely attractive deals begin appearing as a result. But if you happen to be over-leveraged at that particular moment, you simply cannot move to take advantage of those opportunities. If you instead maintain solid cash reserves, you absolutely can act decisively when the moment arrives. Genuine timing, in practice, rewards thorough preparation, not baseless optimism. Now let us talk specifically about refinancing strategy. Refinancing should never be a purely reactive decision made under pressure. It should always be a deliberate, strategic choice made on your own terms. When interest rates drop significantly, refinance specifically to reduce your overall cost of capital and increase your resulting spread. When your available equity increases meaningfully, refinance specifically to access additional growth capital, but only if redeploying that capital elsewhere genuinely produces a positive spread. Refinancing purely to fund additional consumption represents financial regression. Refinancing specifically to fund additional acquisition represents genuine financial progression instead. Timing your refinancing decisions properly requires actively monitoring broader market conditions without becoming genuinely obsessive about it. Watch the larger macroeconomic trends unfolding around you. Understand the natural rate cycles at play, but always evaluate your own personal structure first before reacting to anything happening externally. Here is a genuinely powerful insight worth holding on to. Most significant fortunes throughout history have actually been built during periods of economic downturn. Why exactly is that the case? Because assets frequently become mispriced during those periods. Widespread fear distorts genuine underlying value temporarily. Liquidity effectively becomes king during these specific moments. If you happen to remain financially stable throughout a downturn, you gain a genuinely asymmetric advantage over less prepared competitors. But if you were overextended during the preceding period of expansion, you instead find yourself forced into a purely defensive position. Playing defense alone does not genuinely build lasting wealth. Proper positioning beforehand absolutely does. Now let us briefly discuss the concept of laddering your investments over time. Rather than purchasing everything all at once in a single moment, acquire assets gradually in distinct phases instead. This particular approach genuinely reduces your overall timing risk. If you purchase assets steadily over a period of several years, you naturally smooth out your various entry points along the way. You meaningfully reduce your overall exposure to any single specific market cycle. Laddering your purchases this way reduces the negative impact of volatility considerably. Precise timing becomes noticeably less critical as a result. Consistency, by contrast, becomes considerably more powerful. Here is a subtle truth worth recognizing clearly. People who obsessively try to perfectly time the market frequently end up doing nothing at all in the end. And doing nothing turns out to be the single most expensive strategy of them all. Inflation continues regardless of your hesitation. Genuine opportunities continue passing you by. Time continues compounding steadily against you the entire time you wait. Strategic, deliberate action consistently beats the pursuit of perfect timing. Now, let us briefly address the concept of opportunity cost specifically. Every single year that you delay deploying intelligent leverage represents a full year where your potential compounding remains effectively paused. If your overall structure is genuinely ready to move forward, take action. If it is not yet ready, continue preparing diligently, but never simply remain stagnant indefinitely, because stagnation, in practice, represents an entirely invisible form of financial decline over time. Now here is the genuine core philosophy underlying this entire chapter. You cannot directly control interest rate cycles, economic news headlines, political developments, or major global events as they unfold. But you absolutely can control your own debt structure. You can control your available cash reserves. You can control how carefully you calculate your spread. You can control your overall approach to risk management. You can control your own emotional discipline throughout this process. Control specifically what genuinely lies within your power. Structure your finances deliberately to withstand volatility. Prepare thoughtfully and consistently for eventual downturns. Act decisively whenever the underlying math genuinely aligns in your favor. That, in essence, represents truly strategic timing in practice. In the next chapter, we are going to talk specifically about scaling your wealth beyond simple personal income. Because genuine leverage, properly understood, is not really about replacing your current job income. It is fundamentally about building systems where your income becomes entirely detached from your personal time. And that particular shift is exactly where real, lasting financial power genuinely begins. Chapter 12. Beyond Income. Building systems that outgrow you. There is a genuine ceiling that exists on personal income. No matter how talented you happen to be, no matter how disciplined your daily habits are, no matter how many hours you commit to working, your personal time remains finite. And if your income depends entirely on your time, your overall growth will eventually stall out completely. This represents the hidden limitation that most people never actually manage to escape throughout their entire financial lives. They use leverage successfully to buy assets, but they continue thinking like employees underneath it all. They aim purely to replace their existing salary. They aim simply to match their job income using rental income, and then they stop pushing any further. But true financial power is not really about replacing your income at all. It is fundamentally about detaching your income entirely from your personal presence. That represents an entirely different level of financial achievement. Let us define this progression clearly. Stage 1 involves what we might call survival income, where you directly trade your time for money in the traditional sense. Stage 2 involves asset income, where your various assets begin producing meaningful cash flow on their own. Stage 3 involves system income, where income flows reliably through interconnected systems that operate with only minimal direct involvement from you personally. This particular progression matters because debt itself is not only useful for purchasing individual properties or assets, it can also be used strategically to build genuine infrastructure. Let us talk specifically about systems in this broader sense. A system, properly defined, is something that produces consistent value either with or without your direct daily input. It may occasionally require your oversight. It may periodically require some adjustment on your part, but it should not require constant, ongoing daily labor from you personally. Rental properties, when properly managed, function as systems. Businesses that have hired competent management teams function as systems. Automated digital platforms function as systems. Investments with structured, automatic reinvestment also function as systems. The genuine goal here is not simply to accumulate individual assets one at a time. It is specifically to build interconnected systems that work together. Systems, properly built, create genuine scalability. Scalability creates real asymmetry between effort and reward. Asymmetry, ultimately, creates lasting freedom. Now here is the important shift worth understanding clearly. When you borrow specifically to purchase a single asset, you increase your income somewhat. When you borrow instead to build an entire system, you increase your overall velocity considerably. And velocity, in this particular context, proves far more powerful than simple volume alone. Picture this scenario clearly. You currently own 3 separate rental properties. They each produce reasonable income individually. That represents a genuinely good starting position. But now imagine you also build a proper property management structure around those three properties. Standardized processes, clearly defined systems, strong and consistent tenant screening procedures, organized maintenance workflows, and reliable financial tracking systems. Now, when you add a fourth property to that existing structure, it does not simply double your overall effort and workload. It integrates smoothly into the system you already built. Scalability, achieved this way, genuinely reduces friction over time. This particular point is exactly where many investors unfortunately plateau in their journey. They continue accumulating individual assets without ever building proper systems around them. Everything continues to depend entirely on their personal involvement. Every single problem that arises requires their direct, personal attention. That approach simply is not scalable in any meaningful way. It is, frankly, exhausting to sustain over time. Now let us talk specifically about leveraging a business in this broader sense. Borrowing money specifically to expand a business is not solely about increasing revenue alone. It is fundamentally about improving the underlying structure of that business. If you borrow specifically to hire skilled management, you effectively free up your own personal time. If you borrow to build proper automation into your operations, you meaningfully increase your overall efficiency. If you borrow to invest in genuinely scalable infrastructure, you multiply your overall output capacity. The genuinely important question becomes this: does this particular debt create greater dependency on you personally, or does it actually reduce that dependency over time? If it genuinely reduces your reliance on your own personal time, that represents true structural leverage in action. And structural leverage, when properly built, compounds far more powerfully over time than simple financial leverage ever could on its own. Now let us discuss digital scalability specifically. The modern economy allows for something genuinely unprecedented in human history. You can build assets capable of scaling almost infinitely. Digital products, online platforms, licensing arrangements, software tools, and similar offerings all fall into this particular category. Borrowing money specifically to expand these kinds of systems can create genuinely exponential returns over time. But again, this only works reliably if the underlying structure is genuinely strong. If real market demand has already been clearly validated, and if your overall spread remains genuinely positive throughout. Never borrow money simply to chase hypothetical, unproven scale. Borrow instead specifically to expand scale that has already been proven to work. Here is something genuinely important worth understanding clearly. Building real system income ultimately requires genuine leadership skills, not simple hustle alone. You must consciously transition from being a worker into becoming an architect instead. Architects design entire systems thoughtfully. Workers simply execute individual tasks day to day. Leverage tends to work best specifically for architects because architects naturally think in terms of broader processes, not simply in terms of immediate profit alone. Now let us discuss reinvestment cycles specifically. System income, properly built, naturally produces surplus over time. That surplus then fuels the creation of additional systems. Those new systems further reduce your overall dependency on personal effort. This entire process creates what we might call exponential autonomy over time. At this particular stage, your overall income no longer fluctuates simply based on your personal effort level. It instead fluctuates based primarily on your strategic decision-making ability. And that particular shift represents genuine financial power in its purest form. But here is an important trap worth being genuinely aware of. Many people successfully build one single system, watch it perform well, and then relax completely. They begin simply consuming the resulting profits. They stop actively optimizing the system further. But systems naturally decay over time without continued attention. Markets inevitably shift. Competition continues evolving in the background. You absolutely must continue refining your systems consistently over time. System-based leverage genuinely requires ongoing oversight, though not constant, obsessive micromanagement. Now let us address something deeper here: your own personal identity. Many people genuinely struggle to transition beyond simple income because their entire sense of identity remains tied closely to personal effort. I work hard. I grind constantly. I hustle relentlessly. But true leverage, properly built, actually reduces the need for constant hustle over time. And that particular shift can genuinely feel uncomfortable at first. You must become comfortable instead with strategic oversight rather than constant, ongoing motion. Here is a genuinely powerful framework worth adopting. Every single asset you consider acquiring should answer one clear question for you. Does this particular asset increase my overall income capacity, or does it increase my broader system capacity instead? Income capacity primarily increases your immediate cash flow. System capacity primarily increases your long-term scalability. Both of these genuinely matter in the bigger picture, but system capacity ultimately determines your long-term freedom far more significantly. Now picture this complete scenario clearly. You have rental income reliably covering your personal expenses. You have business systems consistently producing surplus profit. You have dividend streams generating reliable passive cash flow. You have debt structured carefully on favorable terms throughout. At that particular stage, you are no longer simply chasing money day to day. Money is instead flowing naturally through the various systems you have built, and you are primarily directing where that capital gets allocated next. Allocation at this stage genuinely becomes your primary job, not direct production of value yourself. This represents precisely how the genuinely wealthy tend to operate at the highest levels. They allocate available capital thoughtfully. They continuously refine their existing systems. They reposition their debt as needed over time. They carefully analyze broader macroeconomic shifts as they emerge. They think consistently in terms of decades, not simply months or quarters. Now here is the final important shift to take away from this particular chapter. Leverage, properly understood, is not really about simply becoming rich. in some abstract sense. It is fundamentally about becoming structurally independent over time. Structural independence specifically means that your entire life does not collapse if any single income source happens to disappear unexpectedly. Your overall peace of mind is not tied directly to any single paycheck. Your personal time is not sold away hour by hour indefinitely. Your continued growth is not artificially capped by your own personal effort level. That represents the genuine objective worth working toward throughout this entire process. And debt, when used intelligently and deliberately, genuinely accelerates that broader transition. In the next chapter, we are going to talk specifically about the final evolution in this journey, moving from leveraged growth into what we might call sovereign positioning, because at a certain point, you genuinely stop needing leverage altogether, and you instead begin using it only when it remains strategically optimal for your situation. That particular state represents true financial sovereignty in its fullest sense. Chapter 13: Financial Sovereignty. When you stop needing permission. There is a stage that exists beyond leverage, a stage beyond growth itself, a stage beyond simple accumulation. It is not particularly loud. It is not flashy in any visible way. It does not require constant, ongoing expansion to feel meaningful. It is quiet. It is controlled. It is, in the truest sense, sovereign. Financial sovereignty represents the moment you genuinely stop needing permission from anyone or anything. Permission from banks, permission from employers, permission from markets, permission from circumstances beyond your control. Let us define this concept clearly. Financial independence means that your income reliably covers your overall lifestyle. Financial sovereignty means that your underlying structure actively protects your freedom, regardless of whatever volatility happens to arise around you. These are not actually the same thing, even though people frequently confuse them. Many people eventually reach genuine independence. Relatively few ever reach true sovereignty. Independence, in many cases, can remain genuinely fragile. One major disruption, one unexpected legal shift, one significant economic contraction, and suddenly, that sense of stability begins to shake noticeably. Sovereignty, by contrast, requires multiple layered protections built in advance. It requires real optionality. It requires genuine margin built into the structure from the start. Let us break this progression down clearly. At the very beginning of your financial journey, you genuinely need leverage. You borrow specifically to accelerate your progress. You borrow specifically to build your initial foundation. You borrow specifically to expand your reach. Debt, at this particular stage, functions as your engine. But once you reach genuine maturity in this process, debt becomes optional rather than necessary. Not entirely eliminated necessarily, but genuinely optional. You no longer rely on leverage simply to survive financially. You use it only in situations where it remains strategically advantageous for you specifically. That represents real, lasting power. Now picture this particular structure clearly. Your assets generate genuinely strong cash flow consistently. Your overall debt levels remain conservative relative to your accumulated equity. Your liquidity reserves are genuinely substantial. Your various income streams are properly diversified across multiple sources. Your personal expenses remain well controlled. Your overall lifestyle does not demand constant, ongoing expansion simply to feel satisfying. That particular combination represents true sovereignty in practice. You are no longer purely reactive to whatever happens around you. You have become genuinely proactive instead. You no longer fear economic downturns the way you once did. You actively prepare for them well in advance. You no longer simply chase whatever opportunity happens to appear. You carefully select only the ones that genuinely align with your broader goals. There exists a meaningful difference between genuinely needing money and simply choosing to deploy money strategically, because your behavior ultimately follows your underlying beliefs, and those beliefs operate silently and invisibly in the background, yet remain remarkably dominant in shaping your actions. If, deep down, you genuinely believe that money is inherently scarce, you will either hoard it excessively or overspend impulsively. If you believe that money is fundamentally complex and overwhelming, you will tend to avoid building any real structure around it. If you believe that wealthy people simply got lucky, you will never genuinely feel in control of your own financial situation. Your underlying identity dictates your tolerance for risk and discomfort. Your tolerance dictates your actual actions. Your actions ultimately dictate your real-world outcomes. This particular dynamic explains why some people genuinely earn considerably more money over time and still somehow feel financially broke underneath it all, because their fundamental identity never actually shifted along with their rising income. Their income increased, certainly, but their underlying self-image did not change to match it. As a direct result, their spending rises proportionally. Their underlying fear remains exactly the same as before. Their anxiety persists unchanged. Their overall wealth never genuinely stabilizes despite the higher income. Let us talk honestly about what we might call the broke identity for a moment, because understanding this clearly matters. The broke identity focuses primarily on simple survival. It constantly asks questions like, how do I pay this particular bill? How do I make it through this month? What happens if something unexpected goes wrong? It reacts emotionally to events as they happen. It genuinely fears any kind of volatility. It avoids calculated risk almost entirely. It clings tightly to a false sense of certainty, and that particular certainty tends to remain quite small in scope. Now let us talk about what we might call the wealth identity by contrast. It asks fundamentally different questions instead. How do I best allocate this particular capital? How do I strengthen this existing system further? How do I properly protect and expand this overall structure? It naturally thinks in terms of decades, not simply months. It genuinely views economic downturns as opportunities rather than threats. It views debt as a legitimate tool rather than something inherently dangerous. It genuinely values patience above almost everything else. Notice something genuinely important here. The wealth identity remains fundamentally calm throughout this process. Not frantic, not desperate, not impulsive in its decision-making. Calm. Because genuine confidence, in this context, comes directly from having solid underlying structure in place. Here is the genuinely powerful shift worth understanding clearly. You do not need to wait until you have already become wealthy before adopting this particular wealth identity. You adopt that identity first, and genuine wealth tends to follow naturally afterward as a result. This does not mean pretending to be wealthy when you are not. It specifically means learning to think structurally about money, even while you remain in the early stages of your journey. Even if you currently only have access to a small amount of capital. Even if you are genuinely just getting started. Early adoption of this wealth identity means tracking every single dollar carefully, understanding interest rates thoroughly, evaluating opportunity cost consistently, building your reserves intentionally over time, reinvesting your profits consistently rather than spending them immediately. It is genuinely discipline practiced without any applause from others. It is restraint practiced without external recognition. It is patience practiced without any immediate validation. That particular combination represents genuine identity transformation in action. Now let us talk specifically about consumption psychology. If your underlying identity seeks validation primarily through visible lifestyle upgrades, leverage genuinely becomes dangerous for you because increased income simply converts directly into increased personal expenses. You end up scaling your consumption habits instead of scaling your actual assets, and that particular pattern destroys compounding entirely. The wealth identity, by contrast, consistently prioritizes genuine ownership over surface-level appearance, real assets over mere aesthetics, genuine control over outward status, and lasting freedom over momentary flash. This does not mean you must live extremely modestly forever. It simply means you expand your lifestyle intentionally, with real purpose behind each decision. You delay gratification strategically, specifically because you genuinely understand the power of exponential growth over time. Now here is an uncomfortable truth worth confronting honestly. Many people unconsciously sabotage their own path toward wealth. Why exactly does this happen so often? Because genuine wealth requires real responsibility. It requires genuine leadership over your own decisions. It requires consistent emotional regulation. It requires long-term thinking sustained over years. Some people, frankly, become genuinely addicted to chaos in their lives. Addicted to constant urgency, addicted to ongoing drama. Genuine wealth building, by comparison, often feels somewhat boring, stable, structured, and predictable. But boring, in this specific context, is exactly what ultimately builds lasting freedom. Chaos, by contrast, simply builds exhaustion over time. You must consciously decide which particular identity you genuinely want to embrace going forward. Let us briefly address feelings of guilt as well, because this affects more people than you might expect. Some individuals genuinely struggle to grow their wealth because they feel guilty about wanting more in the first place. Guilty for wanting financial success. Guilty for potentially surpassing their peers financially. Guilty for simply thinking differently than the people around them. Understand this point clearly. Wealth that is built ethically through genuine value creation does not represent harm to anyone. It represents genuine contribution instead. When you build real assets, you provide housing to people who need it. You create meaningful jobs. You offer valuable services. You increase overall productivity within the broader economy. The wealth identity genuinely understands this important distinction. It removes unnecessary shame from the entire process. Now let us talk about the fear of visibility that many people experience. As you genuinely grow financially, people around you naturally begin to notice. Family members ask pointed questions. Friends offer unsolicited comments. Critics observe your choices from a distance. If your underlying identity remains fragile, you will likely shrink back in response to this attention. If your identity remains genuinely grounded instead, you simply continue forward regardless. The wealth identity does not actively seek outside approval from others. It seeks solid structure instead. It seeks genuine autonomy. It seeks lasting longevity over time. Now, here is the final identity shift, worth understanding clearly. Moving fundamentally from reactive to proactive. The reactive identity waits passively for bills to arrive before reacting. The proactive identity builds reserves well in advance instead. The reactive identity genuinely fears economic downturns when they occur. The proactive identity actively prepares for them ahead of time. The reactive identity tends to chase whatever trend happens to be popular at the moment. The proactive identity instead builds durable systems designed to last. And this particular shift genuinely happens internally first, well before it ever becomes visible externally to others. You must become, internally, the kind of person who manages leverage calmly and deliberately. The person who tracks their numbers consistently over time. The person who reinvests profits without needing applause from anyone watching. The person who delays consumption strategically when it genuinely serves their longer-term goals. Because if you fail to make this particular internal shift, you will likely build wealth only briefly, before eventually losing it slowly over time. Genuine identity protects your underlying structure, and structure, in turn, genuinely protects your lasting freedom. In the next and final chapter, we are going to bring everything together completely. Because beyond identity, beyond leverage itself, and beyond the various systems we have discussed, there remains one final, crucial truth that most people overlook entirely. And that particular truth ultimately determines whether your accumulated wealth genuinely survives over time or quietly fades away instead. Chapter 14. Integration. Becoming structurally unbreakable. Now everything we have discussed throughout this entire journey genuinely converges into one cohesive whole. Leverage, structure, diversification, timing, systems, identity, durability, philosophy. Individually, Each one of these concepts carries real power on its own. But together, woven into a single coherent approach, they become genuinely transformational. This is precisely where the conversation stops being purely theoretical and becomes deeply personal instead. Because understanding all of these principles intellectually is relatively easy. Actually living them out consistently, day after day, year after year, is genuinely rare. Let us integrate everything we have covered so far. Leverage, without proper identity, becomes genuinely dangerous. Identity without solid structure remains ultimately ineffective. Structure without real durability stays fundamentally fragile. Durability without proper underlying philosophy becomes inherently unstable. And philosophy without consistent execution ultimately means very little in practical terms. You must genuinely weave all of these elements together into a single, coherent approach. Let us simplify this entire process clearly. You begin with honest awareness. You audit your current financial life with complete honesty. No denial, no ego getting in the way, no unrealistic fantasy clouding your judgment. You calculate the actual numbers. You measure your real position accurately. You confront your genuine financial reality directly. Then you clean up your existing foundation. You eliminate genuinely toxic, high-interest debt. You strengthen your available liquidity. You stabilize your overall cash flow. You create real margin within your finances. Without that margin in place, everything you build eventually collapses under sustained pressure. Then you deploy intelligent leverage deliberately, not for status, not for lifestyle upgrades, specifically for genuine asset acquisition, specifically for building real systems, specifically for creating reliable cash flow engines. You calculate your spread carefully every single time. You stress test each potential deal thoroughly. You move forward deliberately and thoughtfully, never impulsively. Then you optimize your existing structure continuously. You refinance whenever doing so genuinely strengthens your overall position. You diversify whenever concentration risk begins increasing beyond a comfortable level. You stagger your various maturity dates intentionally. You build genuine redundancy into your overall structure. You actively protect your available optionality at every stage. Then you scale your systems thoughtfully over time. You reduce your overall dependence on your own personal time and direct involvement. You increase the efficiency of your underlying processes. You consciously shift from being a worker into becoming a genuine architect instead. Your income gradually detaches from your direct labor. Your overall stability increases steadily as a result. Then your underlying identity continues to evolve naturally throughout this entire process. You stop chasing opportunities desperately. You begin constructing your financial life deliberately instead. You stop simply reacting to whatever happens around you. You begin allocating your resources thoughtfully instead. You stop fearing economic downturns the way you once did. You begin preparing for them well in advance instead. Then durability becomes your genuine, ongoing priority. You consistently maintain healthy reserves. You actively resist the natural pull of lifestyle inflation as your wealth grows. You keep your leverage ratios appropriately conservative, even as your overall position strengthens. You think generationally about your wealth, not simply in terms of your own lifetime. You build with genuine longevity firmly in mind. Then philosophy ultimately stabilizes everything you have built. You come to see money fundamentally as a useful tool, nothing more and nothing less. You genuinely value optionality over simple consumption. You respect a sound process over fleeting hype and trends. You understand clearly that calm, sustained consistency consistently beats dramatic, short-lived intensity over the long run. And finally, after walking through this entire progression, you genuinely reach sovereignty. You no longer need anyone's permission to act. You are no longer forced into decisions by external circumstances beyond your control. You are no longer pressured by ordinary market volatility the way you once were. You simply choose your own path freely. That represents the genuine end state worth working toward throughout this entire journey. Not yachts, not public applause, not headlines celebrating your success, simply the freedom of genuine choice. Now let us address something honestly as we close out this audiobook. This particular path is not especially glamorous. It is not dramatic or exciting in any conventional sense. It will not necessarily impress everyone around you who happens to be watching. There will inevitably be entire years where your progress feels frustratingly slow. There will be genuine moments of doubt along the way. There will be real volatility to weather. There will be constant temptation to deviate from your chosen approach. But compounding, by its very nature, consistently rewards discipline, never simple excitement or short-term thrills. And here lies the genuinely difficult truth hidden underneath this entire journey. Building real wealth is actually quite simple to understand conceptually. Spend meaningfully less than you earn. Acquire genuinely productive assets over time. Use leverage intelligently and deliberately. Reinvest your profits consistently. Protect your underlying structure carefully. Think in terms of the long run rather than the short term. That, in essence, is the entire approach. But it remains genuinely difficult to execute emotionally, because human emotion naturally craves speed and immediate results. Ego naturally craves recognition and validation from others. Fear naturally craves a false sense of immediate safety. Desire naturally craves immediate consumption and gratification. And successfully resisting all of these natural impulses genuinely requires real, personal maturity over time. The underlying financial system is not actually cheating you in any meaningful sense. The bank is not genuinely your enemy in this process. Broader markets are not fundamentally working against you personally. But ignorance genuinely works against you. Impulsiveness genuinely works against you. Simple inconsistency genuinely works against you over time. Now, take a moment to genuinely imagine your own life 10 years from today. If you successfully integrate all of these particular principles we have discussed, you wake up each morning without significant financial anxiety weighing on you. Your various systems continue operating smoothly. Your income flows reliably. Your debt remains properly structured. Your reserves stay genuinely strong. Your personal time remains genuinely flexible. You make important decisions calmly and deliberately. That represents the genuine reward waiting at the end of this process. Not simple luxury for its own sake. Not comparison against other people's progress. Simply calm, genuine security without unnecessary fragility. Real growth without underlying chaos. Lasting power without unnecessary arrogance. And here is the final, honest truth worth carrying forward from this entire audiobook. No one is genuinely coming to rescue you financially. Not the government, not your employer, not some unexpected miracle arriving out of nowhere. But here is the encouraging part of that same truth. You genuinely do not need rescuing in the first place. You simply need solid structure. You need real discipline. You need genuine patience. And you need to actually begin this process. Not tomorrow. Not once interest rates eventually change. Not once markets eventually stabilize on their own. Right now. Start small if that feels necessary, given your current circumstances. But genuinely start. Because the only truly dangerous financial trap that exists is ongoing hesitation. And the only genuine financial advantage available to anyone is consistent, structured action sustained patiently over time. Build your leverage carefully and deliberately. Build your systems patiently over the years ahead. Build your underlying identity intentionally, one decision at a time. Build your overall durability deliberately, with real long-term thinking behind every choice. And one day, looking back on this entire journey, you will genuinely realize something profound. The bank never actually controlled you in the first place. The broader system was never genuinely your enemy. It was simply a set of established rules waiting to be understood. And once you genuinely learned to understand those particular rules, you naturally learned how to use them to your own advantage. And once you began using them wisely and consistently, you eventually stopped being dependent on them altogether. That, in the end, is genuine freedom. That is true financial sovereignty. That is what it truly means to make the bank work for you. And that is precisely how you build wealth that genuinely lasts. And with that, we close Make the Bank Work for You, 14 chapters covering everything from the truth about debt, to mastering spread, to using inflation as an ally, to building genuine financial sovereignty that no market cycle can take away from you. Every single principle in this audiobook was designed to shift one specific thing: how you personally relate to debt, to leverage, and to the entire banking system itself. Because once that underlying relationship genuinely changes, everything else downstream from it tends to change right along with it. Now, it is genuinely time to take action. Not next month, not once the perfect opportunity magically appears. This week, sit down and honestly review your own current debt. Calculate your actual spread on anything you currently own. Build out your emergency reserves if you have not already done so. Have an honest conversation with yourself about which particular stage of this journey you currently find yourself standing in. If this audiobook genuinely provided real value for you today, take a moment right now to hit the like button. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it genuinely helps this content reach thousands of other people who need to hear exactly this message. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now represents the perfect moment to do so. We release powerful, in-depth audiobooks, just like this one, every single week, designed specifically to help you think more clearly, act more strategically, and build genuinely lasting wealth over time. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join a growing community of people who are genuinely serious about understanding leverage, building real structure, and achieving authentic financial sovereignty in their own lives. Drop a comment down below and tell us specifically which chapter resonated most strongly with you today. Which particular principle are you planning to apply first this week? We genuinely read every single comment that comes through. Until next time, borrow with intention, structure with discipline. Think in decades, not days. And never forget the central truth running throughout this entire audiobook. The system was never designed against you. It was simply waiting for someone willing to understand it. Now you do. Go out and make it work for you.